The Silent Partner, Helen McDougal and the Burke and Hare Murders. Written by Alana Sanchez, narrated by Vivienne. Copyright 2026 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced, edited, copied, altered, printed, shared, unauthorized storage on electronic devices, or distributed without the written permission of the author. Prologue. The Shadow Behind the Scaffold. On the morning of January 28, 1829, a scaffold was erected in the Lawnmarket, within sight of Edinburgh Castle. The structure was temporary but precise, assembled to perform a single function before a crowd that had gathered long before dawn. Estimates placed the number present at more than 20,000. They filled the street, the surrounding closes, the upper windows. The execution of William Burke was expected to be exemplary. Burke was led to the scaffold shortly after 8 o'clock. He had been convicted of murder less than a month earlier, following a trial that had compressed weeks of death into a sequence of legally manageable facts. The sentence was death by hanging, followed by public dissection. The second penalty was as important as the first. Burke's crimes had been committed in service of anatomy. His body would now be reclaimed by it. The crowd did not come only to see a man die. They came to see an ending. Burke's name had become shorthand for a particular kind of horror: murder without motive other than profit, killing without visible hatred, violence stripped of passion and reduced to method. His victims were poor, transient, unprotected. They disappeared into the anatomy rooms of Surgeons Square, re-emerging as skeletons and specimens, their identities dissolved into medical instruction. The fear this generated was not abstract. It moved through lodging houses and closes, through taverns and kitchens, through rooms where the poor slept in proximity to strangers. It produced a specific anxiety, that death could be administered quietly, indoors, by people already known. The execution promised resolution. It offered the reassurance that the law could still identify evil, isolate it, and remove it from the body of the city. Burke stood on the scaffold alone. William Hare was not present. He had been released months earlier, having turned king's evidence. His reward was freedom, secured through testimony that shifted responsibility decisively onto his former associate. Hare would leave Edinburgh under escort, his movements discreetly facilitated by the authorities. He would not be anatomized. His body would remain intact. Margaret Hare was not present either. She had not been charged. Her role had been acknowledged but never formally tested. She remained within the city, her position ambiguous, her future uncertain. Helen McDougal was not present. Her absence was noted by some observers, but it did not trouble the official narrative. The law had accounted for her. She had stood trial alongside Burke and had been acquitted. The verdict was recorded as not proven. It did not declare her innocent. It did not declare her guilty. It declared the evidence insufficient. In practical terms, it released her. In social terms, it erased her. The scaffold marked the point at which the murders were resolved into a single body. Burke's execution allowed the story to narrow. Complexity could be simplified into spectacle. Complicity could be redistributed. The city's fear could be concentrated and expelled. Yet the Westport murders had not been the work of a single man. They had taken place in domestic spaces, lodging houses, rented rooms, shared beds. They depended on hospitality, on alcohol poured, food prepared, doors opened, conversations conducted without alarm. They required women as well as men, not as caricatures of evil, but as occupants of those spaces, as participants in the ordinary labor of accommodation and care. Helen McDougal lived with Burke throughout the period of the murders. She shared rooms with him. She shared income derived from the sale of bodies. She was present in the lodging house at Tanner's Close when several victims were killed. Witnesses placed her in proximity to the dead, to the drunk, to the unconscious. She was arrested. She was tried. She was released. What she was not given was a narrative. From the moment of Burke's execution, the story of the Westport murders reorganized itself around a set of stable figures: Burke the murderer, Hare the traitor, Knox the anatomist, the victims as cautionary examples of vulnerability. The women receded. When they appeared, it was as adjuncts, wives, mistresses, landladies, defined by relationship rather than action. Helen McDougal's disappearance from the story was not accidental. It was functional. The legal system of early 19th century Scotland was capable of prosecuting women. It was capable of executing them. It was capable of recognizing female violence when that violence conformed to recognizable forms: poisoning, infanticide, domestic cruelty. What it struggled to articulate was female complicity that was sustained, practical, and embedded in male crime without being reducible to coercion or ignorance. McDougal's conduct did not fit easily into the available categories. She was neither the principal offender nor a passive bystander. She did not deliver the fatal acts attributed to Burke and Hare, but she was present for many of them. She benefited materially. She did not report what she witnessed. She continued to live within the structure that enabled the killings. At trial, this ambiguity became her protection. The evidence against her was circumstantial, relational, dependent on inference. The prosecution could not demonstrate that she had directly administered violence. The defense did not need to argue that she was innocent, only that the law required more certainty than the available facts could supply. The verdict of not proven allowed the court to resolve this problem without confronting it. Responsibility could be redistributed once more. Burke would bear the weight. Hare would escape through cooperation. McDougal would pass through the legal process and out the other side, carrying no formal stain and no formal protection. After her acquittal, McDougal attempted to return to ordinary life. She was immediately recognized. Crowds followed her. She was threatened. Stones were thrown. Windows were broken. She was forced to move repeatedly, her presence treated as provocation rather than conclusion. The city that had demanded a reckoning did not know what to do with a woman who had been present at murder and yet could not be punished. Eventually, she vanished from the record. No reliable account documents her death. No confirmed sighting establishes her later life. She did not publish a confession or a defense. She left behind no correspondence. What remains are fragments, hostile press descriptions, trial testimony filtered through male witnesses, official documents concerned primarily with others. Silence became her final condition. This silence has often been interpreted as emptiness, as absence of evidence, absence of agency, absence of importance. Yet silence is not neutral. It is produced. It emerges where categories fail, where responsibility cannot be comfortably assigned, where a figure disrupts the moral economy of a narrative. The Westport murders are frequently described as an episode of singular depravity, contained within a brief period and resolved through decisive punishment. This framing depends on compression, of events, of roles, of blame. It produces clarity at the cost of accuracy. To restore Helen McDougal to this history is not to claim her innocence, nor to exaggerate her guilt. It is to acknowledge that the murders required more than two men acting in isolation. They required domestic infrastructure. They required gendered assumptions about credibility and passivity. They required women whose labor, presence, and silence could be absorbed into male violence without demanding equal scrutiny. The scaffold closed one chapter. It did not explain the whole. Behind Burke's execution lay a network of relationships that the law touched only briefly and then released. Helen McDougal stood at the center of that network, visible long enough to be judged insufficiently dangerous, and then allowed to disappear. This book begins not with the hanging, but with the shadow it cast, the space left behind when responsibility is concentrated onto one body and removed, leaving the rest of the system intact. What follows is not an attempt to fill silence with invention, nor to redeem or condemn where the evidence will not sustain it. It is an examination of what can be known, what was said, what was avoided, and what the erasure of Helen McDougal reveals about the crimes themselves, and about the society that required her to be silent once the scaffold had done its work. Chapter 1: Origins in Darkness. The men who would become William Burke and William Hare did not arrive in Edinburgh as murderers. They arrived as labourers, lodgers, drinkers, and migrants, part of a steady flow of Irish workers drawn into Scottish cities by seasonal employment, military service, and the long, unstable geography of poverty. Their names were not unusual. Their histories were not, at first, remarkable. What made them visible was the economy they entered and the role they found within it. Burke was born in Ireland in 1792, in Orrery, County Cork. Hare's origins are less certain in detail, but he is generally traced to the north of Ireland and appears in Edinburgh by the late 1820s without fixed trade or secure position. Neither man arrived with status. Both arrived with the kind of background that could be reduced, in official records, to occupation and address. By the late 1820s, Edinburgh was a city with two faces, a centre of learning and refinement, and a dense interior of closes, lodging houses, and improvised survival. The contrast was not hidden. It was structural. The city's medical schools, university classes, and private anatomy rooms depended on a steady supply of bodies. At the same time, the people most likely to provide those bodies, through death, through neglect, through anonymity, were concentrated in the same neighborhoods where Burke and Hare lived. The West Port lay on the edge of the city's formal respectability. It was not the most crowded quarter of Edinburgh, but it was one of the most economically fragile, a place of short lets, shared rooms, and drinking houses that converted wages into rent and warmth into debt. The lodging house was not simply a residence. It was a business model. People entered it when they could pay and left when they could not. Those who stayed longest were often those with nowhere else to go. This was the environment in which domestic life and commercial life blurred. A room could be a bedroom, a workplace, a drinking space, and a site of informal credit. A landlady could be a provider, a gatekeeper, and an enforcer. People were watched not by police, but by neighbors and landlords who noticed absences only when absences affected rent. The West Port murders would later be explained as a sequence of individual crimes, a list of victims, a method, a set of payments, a final discovery. In practice, they were enabled by something less dramatic and more durable, the normal functioning of lodging house poverty, where strangers arrived daily, where intoxication was routine, and where the line between care and exploitation was thin. Helen McDougal's origins are less well documented than Burke's, and the record that survives tends to describe her in relation to him. The trial transcript that fixes her name in public memory presents her primarily as Burke's woman, tried beside him, positioned close enough to murder to attract prosecution, yet not close enough, legally, to sustain conviction. Even her name is unstable in print. McDougal, variations that reflect both spelling conventions and the casual handling of working-class women in official narrative. What can be said with confidence is narrower than what later retellings suggest. She lived with Burke during the period of the murders. She drank with him. She occupied the same rooms where victims were lured, entertained, and later removed. She was present often enough for witnesses to recall her, and vulnerable enough to become a target for public anger once Burke's guilt was fixed elsewhere. The relationship between Burke and McDougal was not unusual in its outward form. Cohabitation without formal marriage was common among the poor who moved frequently and worked irregularly. A partnership could offer protection and income, but it could also create dependence, particularly for women whose employment opportunities were limited and whose security was often tied to a man's capacity to earn, fight, or negotiate rent. It also created legal ambiguity. A woman could be both a participant in a household economy and, in court, a figure defined only by proximity. Margaret Hare occupied a different position. The lodging house associated with the Hares made her visible in a way McDougal was not. A landlady's wife was part of the premises, part of the business. She could be noticed moving between rooms, serving drink, collecting rent, assessing lodgers. She could also be treated as an extension of the house itself, present, expected, and therefore overlooked. The official record does not fix Margaret's role with the same intensity as it fixed Burke's, but later accounts place her in the domestic center of the crimes, a woman within the house where people arrived, drank, and stopped being seen. In the story that Edinburgh would later tell itself, the murders began when a lodger died naturally. On November 29, 1827, a man named Donald, often described as a pensioner, died at Hare's lodging house. He had not been murdered. He died of illness, and he died at an inconvenient time, shortly before receiving a quarterly pension payment, while still owing rent. The death created a small financial crisis inside a household that relied on weekly payments. A corpse was not only a moral problem. It was a commercial interruption. The response that followed depended on knowledge that was already circulating in Edinburgh, that bodies could be sold. The medical schools required cadavers. The legal supply was limited. Grave robbing filled the gap, but it was risky and labor-intensive. A dead body inside a lodging house removed some of that difficulty. It did not need to be dug up. It only needed to be transported and presented to the right buyer. The decision to sell Donald's body, rather than bury it, marked the first step. The sale of the dead was not yet murder. It was an adaptation to opportunity. The transition from opportunistic sale to deliberate killing is often narrated as inevitable, a line crossed, a method discovered, a taste for profit awakened. The historical record supports a different interpretation. What emerged was a routine, one that depended on the consistent availability of victims and the predictable willingness of buyers to pay. A lodging house supplied both. People arrived sick, intoxicated, alone. Some were traveling laborers who would not be missed quickly. Some were women whose work blurred into prostitution, whose movements were already unstable, whose disappearance could be interpreted as drift rather than death. Some were local pensioners who moved between city and outskirts, visible but not protected. In each case, the same conditions applied. A person could enter the house without announcement and leave the world without trace. The presence of women in this environment mattered, not as a simple moral category but as practical infrastructure. Women in lodging houses performed the visible work of domestic life: cleaning, feeding, laundering, managing drink, smoothing conflict, negotiating rent. They were also positioned to lower suspicion. A woman offering a drink, a seat, a place by the fire, could appear as care rather than strategy. Hospitality did not need to be invented. It already existed as a commercial and social habit. Murder, in this setting, could be threaded into it. The anatomy trade that made this possible was not hidden from Edinburgh. It was publicly defended as necessary and privately sustained through ambiguous means. Students required bodies to learn. Surgeons required bodies to refine skill. The supply could not meet demand through lawful channels. This created a market in which bodies had a price, and in which buyers could claim moral distance from the methods by which those bodies were obtained. Dr. Robert Knox became the most prominent purchaser associated with Burke and Hare. Their bodies were delivered to his premises in Surgeons Square. Knox's later reputation would be shaped by the fact that he benefited directly from the killings, even if he did not perform them. He could insist on ignorance. He could also insist on necessity. The market allowed both claims to coexist. The murders, when they began, did not require elaborate force. They required isolation and control. The method later associated with the pair, suffocation combined with restraint, was suited to cramped rooms and shared walls. It produced limited external injury and could be framed, if needed, as death by drink or illness. In a lodging house where intoxication was routine, the difference between collapse and killing could be made to look like a matter of degree. What is most striking in the early sequence is the ordinariness of the steps. Victims were plied with alcohol. They were encouraged to stay. They were prevented from leaving. Money changed hands afterward. The same route to Surgeon Square was walked repeatedly. Payment was received. Life in the lodging house continued. This is where Helen McDougal becomes central, not because the surviving record proves she killed, but because the record places her inside the domestic machinery that made killing possible. She is present at the point where private space becomes lethal space. She is present where bodies can be handled, clothing removed, bedding rearranged, rooms cleaned. She is present where suspicious events can be normalized as drunkenness, illness, or quarrel. She is present where the work of concealment is not a single act but a series of small domestic repairs. The historical problem is that this kind of presence is difficult to prosecute. It produces knowledge, influence, and benefit without producing a single clear action that can be isolated and named as murder. Courts are designed to convict on acts. Lodging house crime is sustained by conditions. When Burke and McDougal were brought to trial, the system did what it could do: it narrowed the story. The indictment focused on a single victim whose body was physically found and whose death could be brought into court with witnesses. That victim was Margaret Docherty, also known in sources as Marjorie, Mary, or Maggie, sometimes with the surname Campbell. This narrowing was not a failure of imagination. It was a legal necessity. The trial began on December 24, 1828, at the High Court of Justiciary in Edinburgh. Burke was convicted. McDougal's case was returned as not proven, a verdict that acknowledged suspicion while withholding legal certainty. The city would later treat that outcome not as exoneration but as an administrative technicality that allowed a dangerous woman to slip through. The law had released her. The public did not. None of this was visible in 1827, when Donald died and a body was carried out of a lodging house and into the anatomy market. At that point, the structure was only beginning to form: poverty inside a room, debt inside a relationship, opportunity inside a professional demand. The murders did not emerge from nowhere. They emerged from a city that had learned to treat the dead poor as educational material, and from neighborhoods where the living poor could disappear without immediate accounting. Within that environment, Burke and Hare found a method. Within that method, women were not incidental. They were part of the domestic setting that made the method repeatable. What followed would be presented as a killing spree, but it was closer to production, a sequence of deaths sustained by routine, payment, and the reliable invisibility of certain lives. The origins of the Westport murders lay not only in violence, but in the ordinary conditions that allowed violence to be conducted indoors, quietly, and for profit. The next step was simple: once a body could be sold, a body could be made. And once that possibility entered the lodging house itself began to change, becoming not merely a refuge for the poor, but a site where poverty could be converted into cash, one disappearance at a time. Chapter 2: The Irish Connection. The Westport murders were committed in Edinburgh, sold into Edinburgh's anatomy rooms, prosecuted in Edinburgh's courts, and resolved, at least symbolically, on an Edinburgh scaffold. Yet the people at the centre of the case were not Edinburgh-born. They arrived as migrants. They entered the city already shaped by displacement, seasonal labour, debt, drink, and the fragile domestic economies of the poor. Their pasts did not explain murder. They did, however, explain how a particular kind of life could narrow into a particular kind of choice. For Burke and Hare, Ireland was not a single place. It was a set of conditions: rural work that could not be relied upon, family ties strained by land and inheritance, and a young adulthood in which movement was often the only available strategy. Their Irishness would later be used as a moral shorthand, an easy explanation for violence that Edinburgh preferred not to locate within itself. That shorthand obscured more than it clarified. It replaced history with prejudice. What can be recovered of their early lives comes in fragments: scattered statements, later reconstructions, hostile descriptions, and the occasional detail that survives because it was useful in court. The record is uneven. It describes men more readily than women. It describes crime more readily than childhood. It preserves what was functional and discards what was intimate. Burke, a life of trades, service, and drift. William Burke was born in Ireland in the early 1790s. The exact location varies across accounts, but he was raised in the north, in a Catholic Irish-speaking environment. His father's name appears in some biographical reconstructions, associated with labor rather than land. That alone positions Burke within a class where childhood education, when it existed, was partial, enough literacy for scripture or accounts, not enough to secure stability. Burke was not described consistently as ignorant. He appears, repeatedly, as someone who could read and who valued the appearance of piety. Later witnesses would associate him with religious meetings and a habit of carrying a Bible. That detail mattered to observers because it conflicted with the person they wanted him to be. It suggested an ordinary kind of respectability, performed perhaps but legible. Before Edinburgh, Burke moved through work rather than through institutions. He appears in relation to multiple trades: baking, weaving, cobbling, and to domestic service. This pattern is not unusual. Trades were often learned informally, abandoned when wages failed, and resumed when opportunity returned. The poor did not choose careers. They accumulated survival skills. Military service, or militia service, sits inside that pattern. Burke served in a militia unit in early adulthood. For men like him, enlistment was rarely a matter of patriotic identity. It was wages, clothing, and a ration. It also meant discipline, movement, and familiarity with violence as routine rather than exception. The militia did not create murderers. It normalized hard authority and taught men how to endure bodily strain and hierarchical control. Burke married in Ireland and had children. The marriage did not endure. Accounts converge on a rupture involving land, an argument with a father-in-law, a dispute over ownership, and a departure that looked, in social terms, like desertion. This was not rare in a world where marriage could be both emotional bond and economic trap. Leaving a wife and children was a moral failure, but it was also a practical decision made by men who believed they could build a second life elsewhere. It created a pattern Burke would repeat: severance, replacement, forward motion. When Burke crossed to Scotland, he entered an established Irish labour stream. Canal construction in the early 19th century drew workers willing to travel, sleep rough, drink hard, and accept high risk for short pay. The work was seasonal and brutal. Employment could vanish when a section was finished. Men who arrived to dig and carry did not have a place at the end. They had to find another job, another room, another way of being tolerated. Burke did find a place briefly, outside Edinburgh, small settlements where navvies clustered, where partners formed without ceremony, where poverty made marriage both desirable and difficult. It was in this world, between labor and lodging, that Helen McDougal enters the story. Helen McDougal, the record begins late. Helen McDougal is often described as Burke's wife. That language is convenient and misleading. Contemporary material frequently treated cohabitation as marriage when it suited the narrative, and denied it when it suited the law. McDougal's own marital history was discussed in a way that reveals more about the period's assumptions than about the provable facts. Some accounts describe her as Scottish-born and already married before she attached herself to Burke. The word eloped appears in early descriptions, carrying both scandal and simplification. The difficulty is structural. Women like McDougal did not leave clean documentary trails unless the state needed them to. If she had parents, siblings, schooling, or apprenticeship, the record does not preserve it in any reliable, comprehensive way. The public story of Helen McDougal begins when men begin to die around her. Even so, the outline of her likely early world can be drawn without invention. A working-class Scottish woman of her era would have been shaped by domestic labor early: cleaning, carrying water, laundering, tending children, managing scarce food. Paid work, when available, was often service work: kitchens, lodging houses, laundry, hawking. Education, if received, was usually fragmentary, enough to recognize letters, perhaps enough to read scripture, rarely enough to provide autonomy. Marriage, formal or informal, could offer security and also entrapment. Leaving a husband could mean freedom and could also mean vulnerability. Women who moved did so at cost. When McDougal joined Burke, she entered a partnership built on movement and improvisation. They lived by what could be earned and resold: hawking, second-hand trade, casual labor, seasonal harvest work. The relationship endured for years. That endurance matters. It suggests more than a brief attachment. It suggests a shared domestic economy, shared money, shared rooms, shared reputations, shared drinking. It also suggests shared risk. Hare, the man without a past. William Hare's earlier life is even harder to reconstruct than Burke's. He emerges into documentation as a grown man with a volatile reputation, ill-tempered, hard-drinking, prone to violence, with old scars visible on his face. Biographical accounts disagree even on basics: his exact birthplace, his precise age. He appears as Irish, but Ireland was not an identity that came with stable paperwork for men of his class. A laborer could cross the channel and become a man without history. What seems consistent is the pattern of work. Hare appears as an agricultural laborer before Scotland, and then as a canal worker. Like Burke, he entered the migrant labor world: the same physical demands, the same drink culture, the same unstable housing. When canal work ended, he drifted into casual labor, helping coalmen, odd jobs, and then into the more profitable economy of lodging houses. This shift is crucial. A laborer sells his body's strength. A lodging house operator sells other people's need. It is a different kind of power, smaller in scale, more intimate, exercised through rent, drink, and access to a bed. Hare did not build that business alone. He entered it through a woman. Margaret Laird, widowhood and a house as livelihood. Margaret, usually referred to as Margaret Hare in later retellings, appears in the record first as Margaret Laird, associated with a lodging house that had belonged to her husband. When that husband died, the lodging house remained as her means of survival. Widowhood in this class was not sentimental. It was economic crisis. A widow could inherit responsibility without inheriting stability. Margaret's origins are uncertain in the surviving record. She is often described as Irish, part of the same migrant stream, but the details, parents, siblings, parish, schooling, are not preserved in a reliable way. What is preserved is her position: a woman attached to premises, to rent collection, to the management of lodgers, and to the daily labor that made a house profitable. When Hare attached himself to her, the partnership offered mutual benefit. She gained a man who could enforce order, collect debts, carry bodies, and intimidate troublesome lodgers. He gained access to the lodging house's income and to the social cover that came with being man and wife. Whether a formal marriage occurred mattered less to daily life than to later narrative. In the lodging house world, cohabitation was often treated as marriage in practice, especially when it allowed the couple to operate as a single economic unit. Margaret's role, like Helen's, sits at the intersection of domestic labor and commercial control. A lodging house is not merely a setting. It is a mechanism. It sorts people into rooms, keeps them close, and renders their movements ordinary and unremarkable. It is a space where strangers arrive and are not necessarily noticed leaving. How they ended up here. The question is not how childhood produces murder, but how certain lives narrow into certain conditions. Burke's early life suggests a man capable of adaptation, shifting trades, shifting loyalties, shifting identities. He could perform respectability when it was useful. He could abandon relationships when they became obstacles. He could start again. This is not psychology. It is pattern. Hare's early life suggests a man already positioned at the edge of formal society, less traceable, less anchored, more openly violent. His power would come not from craft or charm, but from physical dominance and opportunism. McDougal's early life is less recoverable, but the shape of her adult circumstances is clear enough to matter. She attached herself to a man who moved, who drank, who traded, who did not offer formal security. She lived in rooms where survival was shared and privacy was minimal. Her autonomy was likely conditional, real in small ways, constrained in larger ones. In such partnerships, women often managed the domestic surface while men negotiated the external world. That surface, drink offered, beds arranged, quarrels contained, could later become the infrastructure of crime. Margaret's life suggests something different, not the mobility of a partner to a laborer, but the fixed labor of premises. She was tethered to a house as livelihood. That tether produced authority over others, but it also produced vulnerability, a need to keep rooms filled, rent coming, drink moving. A lodging house that was empty was not a moral victory. It was collapse. By 1827, the four of them were in proximity, connected by work, drink, and the cramped social circuitry of the poor. The men knew each other through seasonal labor. The women operated within domestic economies that relied on men but were not simply controlled by them. All four lived within a world where bodies were currency, bodies digging canals, bodies carrying coal, bodies selling labor by the day, bodies sleeping for rent, bodies drunk and unconscious on floors. In Edinburgh, a different kind of body had a price as well, the dead body, fresh enough for instruction, anonymous enough to be purchased without questions that could be proved. The Irish connection, in this context, is not a cause. It is a route. It explains how people without stable footing moved into the kind of urban poverty where disappearance was common, where the dead poor were already being converted into profit, and where a lodging house could become the hinge between ordinary hardship and organized killing. The murders began later. The conditions began earlier. What followed was not a sudden transformation into monsters, but the steady exploitation of a system that had already taught them a central lesson, that certain lives could be taken, moved, and sold with only limited consequence, so long as the right people remained silent, and the right people were paid. Chapter 3, Helen McDougal. The Forgotten Woman. Helen McDougal enters the surviving record late and under pressure. Her name becomes visible only when it becomes useful, to witnesses trying to explain what they saw, to prosecutors trying to extend responsibility beyond the man on trial, to journalists trying to satisfy public hunger for a female villain, and to later writers trying to complete a story that otherwise feels too male. This is the first distortion. The record does not preserve Helen McDougal because she mattered to the institutions of her time. It preserves her because she became attached to a scandal that institutions were forced to confront. Everything else is uneven. The easiest claim to make about McDougal is also the least reliable, that she was Burke's wife, that she was Irish, that she was Scottish, that she was a prostitute, that she was a drunkard, that she was a violent woman, that she was a victim of Burke, that she was his accomplice. These labels appear repeatedly across retellings, and they do not agree. They operate less as biographical fact than as narrative necessity. A woman placed near male violence is rarely allowed to remain undefined. What can be said with confidence is narrower, but more valuable. McDougal lived with Burke for years before the Westport murders. She shared accommodation with him in different places. She moved when he moved. She drank when he drank. She was known well enough in certain circles that people could identify her later. She was present in Edinburgh during the period when bodies were being generated and sold. She was arrested after the final victim. She stood trial. She walked out of court alive. She did not walk out of the story. To understand how she ended up there, the question has to shift. It cannot be only what kind of woman was she, because the evidence is too thin to answer that cleanly. The more reliable question is, what kind of life produces a woman who can live inside a room where bodies are being sold, and still have no stable trace of her childhood, her family, or her later fate? The answer lies in class, in migration, and in the domestic economies that sit beneath official history. The problem of origins. Working-class women in the early 19th century rarely appear in records as children unless something goes wrong. Orphanhood, institutional care, illegitimacy, prosecution, parish support, these generate paperwork. Ordinary labor does not. A girl born to poor parents might spend her youth moving between households as service, as kin labor, as informal work paid in food, as short-term paid labor in laundry or field work. None of this required registration beyond what a local community kept in memory. If she moved, that memory broke. McDougal's later life suggests movement. It suggests association with migrant labor environments. It suggests lodging house life. These are not the contexts that preserve genealogies. They are the contexts that break them. If she was Scottish, her early years could have been shaped by industrial and agricultural instability, families living on marginal wages, fathers employed irregularly, mothers managing households under constant scarcity. If she was Irish-born, her early years would have been shaped by the pressures that pushed so many west and north: land insecurity, employment scarcity, political and sectarian tension. Either way, childhood would have been practical rather than protected. Girls in her class learned early how to make themselves useful. Education, if it existed, would have been intermittent. Schooling was available in some forms, but attendance competed with domestic need. Literacy was not guaranteed. It was a tool, sometimes acquired, sometimes not. The record does not preserve whether McDougal could read or write. Later depictions frequently assume ignorance as part of her type. That assumption is common and unreliable. The difficulty is not that her origins are unknowable. It is that they were never important to the people who wrote the documents that survive. When male criminals are described, their childhoods are often reconstructed because they are treated as explanatory. When women are described, their origins are more often treated as irrelevant or as a moral stain. A woman is expected to be either naturally corrupt or naturally helpless. Her past is used to serve that expectation. McDougal's past resists the template because too little survives to support either comfortingly. Becoming Burke's woman. However McDougal began, she became visible to history as Burke's partner. This was not a brief attachment, and it was not a trivial one. Cohabitation for years created a shared life, shared lodging, shared money, shared exposure, shared reputational risk. In the labor and lodging economy, partners were rarely purely romantic. They were practical. Burke's adult life before Edinburgh follows a recognizable pattern of working-class male drift: trades attempted, militia service, marriage, rupture, migration, temporary work, drink culture. McDougal's attachment to him placed her inside that pattern. It likely meant long periods of uncertainty, short periods of income, and frequent movement. In such a partnership, the woman's role was not automatically passive. In working-class domestic economies, women often managed the surface of life: food, bedding, domestic order, negotiation with neighbors, small-scale buying and selling, the maintenance of appearances necessary to keep a landlord tolerant. Men might negotiate the external world of wages, but women negotiated the internal world of survival. That internal world is precisely where the Westport murders occurred. The partnership also created dependence. A woman who cohabited with a man without formal marriage could find herself economically bound without legal protection. Leaving was possible. It was also costly. If she had already left one relationship, if she had already crossed social thresholds that reduced her options, her capacity to walk away would have been constrained further. Women could leave. Many did. The point is not that she could not leave. The point is that leaving was not a neutral act. It carried consequences that men did not share. This matters because later narratives tend to flatten McDougal into one of two figures, either a willing accomplice or a coerced victim. Both are narratives of simplicity. A long cohabiting partnership in poverty does not tend towards simplicity. It tends towards entanglement. Reputation as evidence. By the time the murders were discovered, McDougal already carried a reputation in the neighborhoods where Burke moved. Witness descriptions later emphasized her drinking, her temper, her loudness, her rough language, her physical presence. These descriptions cannot be treated as pure fact. They are mediated by class contempt and by the storytelling needs of scandal. But they should not be dismissed either, because they reveal what observers chose to notice. Working-class women were policed by reputation. A man could drink and fight and still be treated as a rough fellow. A woman who drank or fought could be treated as inherently deviant. The same behaviour carried different moral weight depending on gender. When a scandal required a female figure to be defined, reputation became a substitute for biography. McDougal's reputation was likely shaped by her environment. Migrant labor communities, lodging houses, and street economies demanded toughness. A woman who could not defend herself could be exploited quickly. A woman who could defend herself would be described as violent even when she was surviving. The record does not permit a clean moral reading. It does permit one conclusion: she was noticeable. Not all women in the West Port were visible. Some disappeared without comment. McDougal was noticed. That suggests she was not entirely peripheral. She occupied space in a way that could be remembered. The domestic stage of the murders. The West Port murders were not committed in alleys or on roads. They were committed indoors. They were committed in rooms where beds were made, where meals were prepared, where clothing was stored, where neighbors shared walls. They depended on domestic credibility. A lodging house is often imagined as chaotic. In reality, it is structured by necessity. People arrive, pay, drink, sleep. They are assessed quickly. Can they pay? Can they be managed? Are they trouble? Are they useful? Are they likely to be missed? The lodging house sorts vulnerability. Women in these spaces often performed the work that made the environment appear ordinary. A woman offering a drink, washing a cup, arranging bedding, making conversation, could normalize a stranger's presence. Male violence could then occur inside that normality. A man could restrain and suffocate. A woman could keep the rest of the house quiet, keep another lodger distracted, keep the mood plausible. This is not to claim that McDougal necessarily performed those roles in each killing. It is to identify what her presence meant. If she was living in the rooms where killings occurred, she was living inside an environment where domestic labor and concealment became intertwined. Even if she never raised a hand, the infrastructure of murder included tasks that were traditionally female and often invisible: cleaning, managing clothing, managing appearance, managing story. This is one reason her part has been difficult to narrate honestly. The law prosecutes acts. The lodging house produces conditions. A woman can be central to conditions without being easily prosecuted for a single act. Knowledge as a form of participation. A person who lives through repeated concealment accumulates knowledge. Knowledge is not the same as direct action, but it is not nothing. In the West Port case, the question of McDougal's knowledge became the central problem. What did she know, when did she know it, and what did she do with that knowledge? The prosecution attempted to convert knowledge into culpability. The defense attempted to convert knowledge into uncertainty. The public attempted to convert knowledge into moral guilt regardless of verdict. The legal difficulty was predictable. If the evidence could not prove that she performed the killing act, then the court had to consider whether her knowledge and presence could be sufficient. The law of the period did allow for concepts of aiding and abetting, but the available evidence in her case was tangled, dependent on witness credibility, dependent on inference, and complicated by the fact that the principal case was already strong against Burke. A court under pressure often chooses clarity. Clarity required a principal villain. Burke could be made into that. McDougal complicated it. The final victim and the closing net. The murders remained rumors until a body became difficult to remove. The final victim, Margaret Docherty, entered the lodging house late in the sequence, when patterns were already established. The circumstances that drew her in were ordinary: drink, companionship, a promise of lodging, temporary money. The nature of her vulnerability was not unique. What was unique was that other lodgers became involved in observation, and their observation became evidence. This is where McDougal becomes visible not as an abstract accomplice, but as a woman moving through a specific domestic space at a specific moment. Witness accounts later describe her presence, her drinking, her movements, her words. They describe a household under strain, strangers noticing more than they were supposed to notice, neighbors close enough to overhear, the usual smoothness of lodging house routine beginning to crack. When Docherty disappeared, suspicion did not attach evenly. It attached first to Burke. That was partly because he was the most visible male actor. It was partly because he could be made into the center of the story. McDougal was drawn in because she was present and because the public demanded that a woman attached to a murderer must be either guilty or pathetic. She resisted being pathetic. Trial: The limits of proof. The trial that followed placed McDougal in the harshest position a woman could occupy in a public criminal narrative, adjacent to death, adjacent to male violence, and evaluated through assumptions rather than through independent documentary life. She was indicted alongside Burke for the murder of Doherty. The court proceedings did not primarily seek to understand her. They sought to decide whether the evidence rose to the level required for conviction. This distinction matters. Courts do not write biographies. They filter chaos into legally meaningful sequences. Witness testimony about McDougal was shaped by two forces: what the witness could reliably remember, and what the witness believed the court wanted. People who had lived near the Westport murders were suddenly required to become narrators of coherence. Their memories were pressured into order. In that process, women like McDougal were frequently rendered as types: the disreputable woman, the drinking woman, the violent woman, the coarse woman, the woman who must have known. These types served a function. They made complex domestic life legible to middle-class moral imagination. The verdict returned for McDougal, not proven, was not an exoneration in the modern sense. It was a statement about evidence. It implied that suspicion remained, but the law would not finalize it. In a quieter case, that might have ended the matter. In Edinburgh, it did not. After acquittal, legal release, social pursuit. Once McDougal left court, she was no longer protected by the legal process. She was also not protected by a narrative of innocence. She had been publicly associated with murder. Her presence in the city became intolerable to a population that wanted neat moral conclusions. Crowds pursued her. She was recognized in streets and lodging places. Reports describe hostility that was immediate and physical. Stones were thrown. Threats were made. She was forced to move. The city that had demanded a trial did not accept the result. This is the moment when the concept of not proven reveals its social function. It allows the state to release a person without rehabilitating them. It satisfies legal standards while leaving the public free to treat the released person as guilty in practice. McDougal lived inside that gap. It is here that she becomes the forgotten woman in a precise sense. Not forgotten because no one remembered her, but forgotten because the record stops following her once she stops serving the dramatic core of the narrative. Burke's execution allowed the story to resolve. McDougal's ongoing existence did not. The need for her to be punished continued after the court had declined to punish her. That pressure likely forced her into flight. Where she went is unclear. Later claims place her in various towns, various countries, various endings. Some accounts suggest she left Scotland. Some suggest she was beaten. Some suggest she died early. These claims are difficult to verify. They persist because they satisfy narrative appetite. The audience wants either punishment or redemption. The record provides neither. In the absence of documentation, folklore expands. The ethics of writing her. A woman-centered account of the Westport murders cannot simply promote McDougal into the position Burke occupied. That would repeat the same narrative simplification, merely changing the gender of the villain. It would also fail the evidence. The surviving material does not support a clean claim that she was the primary killer, and it does not support the claim that she was entirely ignorant. A more honest approach is harder: to treat her as a participant in a domestic economy that became murderous, and to explore what kinds of female participation were possible within that economy. Female participation in violent crime does not always look like direct violence. It can look like access, facilitation, concealment, normalization, and silence. These forms of participation are often treated as secondary because they do not fit dramatic expectations. Yet without them, many crimes do not sustain themselves. McDougal's likely role sits in that difficult space. She lived with Burke. She moved through the rooms. She shared the proceeds of the household. She did not withdraw. The question is not whether this makes her a monster or a victim. The question is what it reveals about how violence can be domesticated, made routine inside shared life. The Westport murders were not committed in isolation from ordinary domestic practice. They were threaded through it. This is the significance of Helen McDougal, regardless of whether she killed. She represents the point where female domestic labor, female dependency, and female survival strategies intersect with male violence and profit. A silent narrator cannot assign motives that cannot be proved. It can identify conditions and patterns. It can show how a woman without secure social position can become entangled in crime without leaving the kind of record that later readers expect. McDougal's biography is incomplete because she belonged to a class whose lives were not preserved. Her criminal association is preserved because it threatened the city's moral order. Her disappearance is preserved only as rumor because once the city had an executed man, it no longer required her to be documented. That is what it meant to be the forgotten woman in the Westport murders, present at the center, then forced out of the frame. The shadow she casts forward. McDougal's story cannot be separated from Margaret Hare's. If McDougal was Burke's partner, Margaret was the woman attached to the premises that generated victims. She represents a different form of female positioning, not the mobile partner of a drifting laborer, but the fixed operator of a lodging house economy. In later retellings, the two women are often collapsed into a single moral category, the women who helped. This collapse is convenient and false. Their positions were not the same. Their risks were not the same. Their options were not the same. Their forms of power were not the same. Understanding McDougal requires seeing her as a woman whose life was built on movement, dependence, and the domestic management of instability. Understanding Margaret Hare requires seeing her as a woman whose life was built on premises, rent, and the controlled intimacy of lodging house authority. The murders needed both environments, the drifting world that delivered vulnerable people to the city, and the fixed domestic spaces that could convert those people into profit. McDougal sits at the seam between the two. Chapter 4, Margaret Hare. The landlady's wife. Margaret Hare is most often described as a supporting figure, the landlady's wife, the woman in the kitchen, the presence in the background while men did the work. That framing is convenient. It allows the murders to remain a masculine story and reduces female involvement to atmosphere. It is also misleading. A lodging house is not a neutral setting. It is a controlled environment. It has rules, routines, thresholds, and an internal economy that depends on constant judgment: who is allowed in, who is encouraged to stay, who is charged, who is trusted, who can be exploited, and who is too risky to keep. In that environment, the woman attached to the house is not merely background. She is infrastructure. Margaret's problem historically is similar to Helen McDougal's. The surviving record is fullest when scandal requires her to exist and thins again when the story narrows to the most legally useful villain. Yet Margaret's position offers more to work with than Helen's, because a lodging house woman is witnessed more often. Her role is more public. Her labor is more visible. It generates more incidental memory in the people who move through the premises. What it does not generate is a clean childhood biography. The poor are not documented carefully. Women are documented less carefully than men. When women are documented, it is often through someone else's name: husband, landlord, employer, court clerk. Margaret appears most clearly not as herself, but as a woman attached to a house that became a killing site. Before Hare, premises and survival. Margaret is frequently referred to as Margaret Hare, as though that were her original identity. In practice, she enters the historical record as Margaret Laird, associated with a lodging house and with a husband who operated it. That detail matters because it places her within a particular working-class niche: the poor housekeeper, the woman whose domestic labor is inseparable from commerce. To run or help run a lodging house was not genteel work. It meant constant cleaning, constant negotiation, constant proximity to drink, violence, illness, and debt. It meant managing strangers who slept in close quarters and arrived with unknown habits. It meant collecting rent in a world where rent was paid late, paid partly, or not at all. It meant deciding when to tolerate a lodger and when to remove one. It meant, often, using alcohol as both product and social control. Many lodging houses were not businesses in the way later readers imagine. They were survival structures. They operated on narrow margins. Profit depended on full beds, quick turnover, and the ability to extract payment from people who had little. If Margaret was widowed while still attached to premises, her future would have tightened rapidly. Widowhood in this class was not a protected status. It was exposure. A widow could inherit the responsibility of rent, food, and maintenance without inheriting enough stability to sustain them. She might take in more lodgers. She might sell more drink. She might attach herself to another man who could provide muscle and negotiation capacity. When William Hare entered her life, the partnership solved practical problems for both. Hare as partner, violence and capacity. Hare's reputation in later descriptions is consistent. He is presented as volatile, quick to anger, a man comfortable with threats. For a lodging house operation, this could be an advantage. The house required enforcement. It required someone who could push a lodger out, collect a debt, intimidate the troublesome, and deter theft inside crowded rooms. This is how the landlady's wife becomes a strategic figure. Margaret did not need to be physically dominant to benefit from physical dominance. She could run the surface of the house, food, bedding, drink, conversation, while Hare handled confrontation. Together they could operate as a single unit that controlled an environment where other people were always slightly insecure. The partnership also created a small domestic court, a place where lodgers depended on the couple for access to bed and warmth. Dependence produces compliance. Compliance produces opportunity. This is the background against which the crimes developed. The murders did not begin in a vacuum. They began in an economy already accustomed to handling bodies, sick bodies, drunk bodies, bodies that collapsed, bodies that died. The first turning point, Donald's death and the lesson learned. The first widely cited pivot in the case is the death of an old lodger known as Donald, described as a pensioner. The significance of his death is not that it was murder, but that it became an economic problem. He died owing money, and he died at a moment when a pension payment was expected. This is a familiar lodging house crisis. A dead lodger does not pay. A dead lodger occupies space. A dead lodger creates the administrative nuisance of burial. In a setting already pressed by rent and food, this kind of interruption could feel like catastrophe. The solution the Hares chose was not unique in concept. The selling of bodies to anatomy schools was known. The shortage of legal cadavers was an open secret. The work of resurrection men had been discussed widely enough to create both fear and familiarity. In that context, a dead body inside a house could be reframed as a commodity. Donald's body was sold. Money changed hands. A legal and moral line was crossed, but it was crossed under the cover of practicality. The man was already dead. That transaction taught a lesson. It demonstrated that death had a price, and that the price could be collected quickly, without the risks of grave robbing. The house itself could become a supplier. The next lesson was darker. If a dead body could be sold, then an additional dead body could be created. The lodging house as engine. A key feature of the Westport murders is their dependence on indoor control. Victims did not need to be abducted. They did not need to be chased. They only needed to be persuaded to enter and then prevented from leaving. Lodging houses are designed for that. People arrived for warmth, drink, companionship, and a bed. They accepted alcohol offered by hosts because that was normal hospitality. They accepted the intimacy of crowded rooms because that was the lodging house condition. They fell asleep or passed out because drink was common and exhaustion was constant. The house did not merely provide concealment. It provided plausibility. A person who staggered inside and was not seen again could be explained away by the usual movement of the poor, leaving early, moving on, returning to the road, being arrested, being sick elsewhere, being lost in the city. A lodger's disappearance did not automatically trigger alarm. It often took days for anyone to ask questions, and longer for anyone to act on suspicion. In this environment, Margaret's role becomes more legible. A woman attached to the premises had the capacity to observe which lodgers were isolated and unlikely to be missed. Encourage intoxication without attracting suspicion. Normalize a stranger's prolonged presence in the house. Manage the domestic evidence afterward: bedding, clothing, surfaces, smell, disorder. Shape the story told to neighbors and other lodgers. These actions are rarely recorded as criminal because they can be described as ordinary lodging house labor. That is precisely why they are effective. Crime can hide inside ordinary work. The transition from opportunism to routine. Once murder began, the pattern appears to have hardened quickly. The killings are often presented as spontaneous, but the sequence suggests repetition and refinement. The method attributed to the men, restraint and suffocation, producing minimal external injury, was well suited to indoor murder and rapid disposal. It allowed a body to be moved quickly and presented to buyers in a condition suitable for anatomy. The financial motive was clear. Bodies fetched sums that exceeded what many laborers could earn through weeks of hard work. This created an incentive structure that made repetition more likely. It also created an internal logic. Once money was acquired through killing, ordinary labor began to look like a poor investment. This is where the women's presence becomes again a practical factor. Routine murder inside a lodging house requires that the household continue to operate: meals, washing, drink, and the outward appearance of a functioning premises. If the house became visibly chaotic or suspicious, it would draw attention. Domestic order was not only comfort, it was cover. Margaret's labor, keeping the house running, could therefore become part of the murder economy without necessarily being narrated as such by contemporaries. A woman could maintain the conditions under which murder remained undetected, and later be described merely as there. The crimes, victims as categories, not characters. The Westport murders are often retold as a catalogue of victims, some given names and vivid descriptors, others barely remembered. The difference is not moral importance. It is narrative survival. Certain victims were remembered because they had distinctive traits that made them useful to testimony and press. A well-known local figure, a young woman described as beautiful, a man with a disability, a final victim whose body triggered discovery. From the standpoint of the murderers, victims were sorted differently. They were assessed by vulnerability and risk. Certain categories were particularly useful: the sick and chronically poor, who already looked near death; the intoxicated, who could be controlled with minimal struggle; women on the margins, whose movements were socially discounted; people without close kin nearby, whose absence would not immediately be pursued. This sorting process is the real horror. It treats human beings as supply. A lodging house made this sorting easier. It brought vulnerable people into a controlled domestic environment and rendered their continued presence ordinary. Mary Patterson and the usefulness of beauty. One victim who survives prominently in later narrative is Mary Patterson, often described as attractive and young. The way she is remembered reveals as much about Victorian and later sensibilities as it does about the crime. Her beauty becomes the hook, her humanity becomes secondary. She is treated as a symbol of corrupted youth rather than as a poor woman navigating survival. The details that persist about her death often include heavy drinking and a sudden collapse, consistent with the general method: intoxicate, isolate, suffocate, remove. Her body, like the others, entered the anatomy trade. The emphasis on her beauty serves a narrative function. It makes the murder feel more shocking because it violates an aesthetic expectation. The murders themselves did not distinguish beauty from ugliness. They distinguished only between profitable and risky. This is a useful place to position Margaret's role again. A woman in the house could help make the drinking social, safe, and plausible. A male host offering drink could signal predation. A female presence could signal ordinary companionship. That signal would matter to a vulnerable woman entering a lodging house. Nothing about this requires that Margaret directly killed. It requires only that her presence made the environment more credible. Daft Jamie, and the danger of recognizable victims. Another victim who became central in public memory was James Wilson, widely known as Daft Jamie. His killing became especially risky because he was recognizable in the streets. His absence could not be easily explained as ordinary movement. People noticed. This points to an important feature of the crimes: the murderers were capable of taking risks that would appear irrational to later readers. Yet when murders become routine and profitable, risk tolerance often increases. The desire for income can override caution. Familiarity with concealment can create overconfidence. The killing of a recognizable man also reveals something about the internal moral world of the perpetrators. Vulnerability was not a barrier. It was an advantage. For Margaret, this kind of risk would have had implications. A lodging house operator is not insulated from neighborhood gossip. A recognizable victim disappearing after entering the premises could bring danger to the house itself. If the killings continue despite that, it suggests either that the household felt protected by routine and luck, or that profit had become more compelling than caution. Either conclusion reinforces the sense of crimes turning from opportunism into production. Margaret as participant: what can be said, and what cannot. The surviving record does not permit a simple statement such as Margaret helped kill the victims in a legally precise way. What it permits is a layered description of involvement. She was part of the household that controlled the premises. She benefited from the household economy that expanded as bodies were sold. She was present in an environment where repeated disappearances occurred. She was positioned to observe and manage the domestic realities of concealment. She was not prosecuted in a way that forced the court to test her culpability fully. This last point matters. The legal outcomes in the Burke and Hare case did not map neatly onto moral responsibility. Hare was rewarded because the state needed his testimony to secure a conviction. Burke was executed because the state needed a definitive villain. The women became residual figures, useful for testimony, dangerous for narrative complexity, and therefore flattened. Margaret's lack of prosecution is often treated as proof of lesser involvement. That is a comforting assumption. It is not a reliable one. Legal attention follows strategy. A lodging house woman who might have been difficult to convict could be left alone if the authorities had already secured the primary conviction they needed. The system did not require that every guilty person be punished. It required that the case be resolved convincingly enough to restore public faith. Burke's body on the scaffold served that purpose. The domestic mechanics of concealment. The Westport murders were sustained not only by violence but by the work that followed violence. This is where women become central to an honest account. A body leaves traces. A struggle disturbs a room. Clothing, bedding, and smell tell stories. In a lodging house, those stories can be managed quickly because disorder is already common. Yet repeated killings would still require repeated repair. The repair work includes washing linens or replacing them, explaining missing clothing or sudden cleaning, managing other lodgers' curiosity, controlling access to certain rooms, creating distractions through drink and noise, maintaining a steady flow of ordinary activity so the house does not feel wrong. These are tasks historically associated with women not because women are naturally suited to them, but because women were assigned the domestic labor of poor households. When violence enters the household, the domestic labor becomes part of the violence's concealment. Margaret's likely involvement sits here. It is not sensational. It is precisely what makes it plausible. The narrowing of the story, why Margaret fades. When the murders were discovered, the narrative narrowed rapidly to what could be prosecuted most effectively. A single victim, Margaret Docherty, became the legal anchor because her body's disappearance and discovery could be described in court with witness evidence tied to a specific time frame and location. The broader series of murders, though widely believed, was harder to prosecute case by case. The law chose what it could hold. Within that narrowing, Margaret Hare becomes awkward. She is attached to Hare, the man the state needed as a witness. Aggressively pursuing his wife could destabilize his cooperation. It could also complicate the public story by suggesting that the crimes were not simply the product of two male monsters, but of a household economy. Household economies are harder to punish because they resemble the ordinary. So Margaret recedes. She remains present in the margins as a figure of suspicion, but she does not become the center of prosecution. Her moral guilt becomes a matter of public talk, not legal judgment. This is how women in these narratives are often handled, either elevated into the monstrous female accomplice when it is theatrically useful, or dismissed into the domestic background when it is strategically useful. Margaret occupies the second category, where this leaves the reader. If the murders are treated as a masculine conspiracy, Margaret becomes optional. If they are treated as a domestic production, an economy conducted in rooms, Margaret becomes indispensable. The lodging house was not merely a venue. It was the instrument. Margaret's significance is not that she replaces Burke or Hare as the chief agent of murder. It is that her position explains how the environment remained stable enough for repeated killing to occur, a house that continued to function as a house while simultaneously functioning as a supply point for anatomy. Chapter 5. The Westport. Edinburgh's underbelly. The Westport was not hidden from Edinburgh. It was not a secret quarter, nor an unknown slum lurking beyond the city's awareness. It sat openly on the western edge of the old town, a narrow artery linking the formal city to roads that led outward, to the countryside, to labor, to departure. People passed through it daily. They drank there. They lodged there. They avoided it when they could. Its reputation was long-standing and imprecise. It was described as poor, rough, dangerous, immoral. These labels did not mean the same thing to everyone. To middle-class observers, the Westport represented disorder and moral failure. To the people who lived and lodged there, it represented proximity, to work, to shelter, to drink, to other people who understood how precarious survival could be. This was not a place where the poor were temporarily stranded. It was a place designed, by economics rather than planning, to absorb instability. Geography as condition. The Westport was shaped by density. Buildings were old, subdivided, altered repeatedly to accommodate more bodies than they were originally built for. Rooms were shared. Beds were shared. Air moved poorly. Sound traveled easily. Privacy was rare. Movement was constant. Closes opened suddenly from the street, leading into narrow passages where light diminished and activity condensed. People cooked, slept, drank, argued, and died within earshot of one another. This density created a particular social logic. Nothing was entirely private, but much was ignored. Survival required selective attention. In such a place, disappearance could be both obvious and unremarkable. Someone gone might be noticed, but the explanation did not have to be sinister. People moved on. People were arrested. People fell ill. People returned to Ireland. People disappeared into other lodging houses. The assumption of movement filled gaps that would otherwise demand investigation. The Westport's physical structure made it difficult for outsiders to see clearly inside it. Doors opened onto shared spaces. Rooms were repurposed. Neighbors knew each other's sounds, not each other's histories. The police presence was limited and reactive. Authority entered only when summoned, and was often resented when it did. This environment did not create murder. It made concealment easier. Lodging houses as micro-societies. The lodging house was the Westport's central institution. It was not a home in the sentimental sense. It was a commercial arrangement conducted through intimacy. People paid to sleep near strangers. They accepted discomfort as the price of warmth. They entered into short-term social contracts governed by money, drink, and tolerance. Lodging houses varied in size and reputation, but they shared certain features. Payment was usually collected nightly or weekly. Drink was often sold on the premises, either openly or informally. Food might be prepared communally or individually. Rules were enforced inconsistently, depending on the temperament of the operators and the behaviour of the lodgers. Crucially, lodging houses required constant assessment of people. A landlady or landlord learned quickly who was likely to pay, who was likely to fight, who was likely to attract police attention, and who could be exploited. Vulnerability was not a moral category. It was a practical one. A person who arrived alone, intoxicated, poorly dressed, or unwell could be treated as a burden, or as an opportunity. That judgment could shift rapidly. Someone too sick to work might still be able to drink. Someone too drunk to leave might still pay for a bed. Someone who could not pay might still be useful in other ways. This logic underpinned the murders. Drink as lubricant and disguise. Alcohol was central to Westport life. It was sold, shared, consumed, and relied upon. It eased cold, hunger, pain, boredom, and despair. It also dulled awareness, weakened resistance, and blurred responsibility. In lodging houses, drink served multiple functions. It was a source of income. It was a social adhesive. It was a tool for managing lodgers' moods. It was also a plausible explanation for collapse. A person who fell unconscious after heavy drinking did not immediately attract suspicion. A person who died after drinking heavily could be assumed to have succumbed to illness or excess. In a neighborhood where drink-related deaths were not unknown, alcohol provided both cause and cover. This mattered enormously for the murders. Intoxication reduced the need for overt force. It reduced noise. It reduced the likelihood of struggle that might draw attention. It allowed suffocation to be disguised as sleep or collapse. It allowed bodies to be moved without immediate alarm. Women in lodging houses often controlled access to drink. They poured it, sold it, encouraged it. This was not a criminal act. It was normal practice. But when drink became part of a killing routine, its ordinary distribution became lethal. Noise, silence, and selective hearing. The Westport was not quiet. People shouted, sang, argued, cried, and fought. Sounds overlapped. Walls were thin. What mattered was not whether something could be heard, but whether it was worth responding to. Selective hearing was a survival skill. Responding to every disturbance would have made life impossible. People learned to ignore cries that could be attributed to drink, domestic disputes, or ordinary misery. Intervention carried risk. A person who interfered could be injured, ostracized, or drawn into trouble. This social habit protected the murderers. A struggle behind a door could be dismissed as quarreling. A thump could be dismissed as collapse. Silence afterward could be dismissed as sleep. Only when patterns broke, when something was too strange, too quiet, too persistent, did curiosity sharpen into suspicion. Bodies and anonymity. The Westport's population included people who were already socially invisible. Migrant laborers, elderly pensioners, women without fixed employment, people with disabilities, people estranged from family. These lives did not generate immediate inquiry when disrupted. Anonymity was not absolute. People recognized faces. Nicknames circulated. But recognition did not equal protection. Being known did not mean being defended. This is why certain victims stand out in later accounts. A man known as Daft Jamie was recognizable enough that his absence disturbed the usual assumptions. A young woman described as beautiful was remembered because she disrupted expectations of disposability. These cases felt exceptional precisely because they violated the underlying rule that some people could vanish without consequence. The Westport enforced that rule daily, long before Burke and Hare exploited it. Policing the poor. Formal policing in early 19th century Edinburgh was limited in scope and reach. Watchmen and constables existed, but they were few, poorly paid, and often distrusted. Their authority depended on cooperation from communities that had little incentive to invite scrutiny. The poor learned to avoid the law unless absolutely necessary. Police involvement could lead to arrest for unrelated offenses, loss of lodging, or unwanted attention. Reporting suspicion carried risk, especially when suspicion involved neighbors or landlords on whom one depended. This reluctance created a buffer around criminal activity conducted indoors. Unless violence spilled into the street or disrupted public order, it could remain contained. The murders exploited this buffer. The anatomy trade as background noise. The presence of anatomy schools in Edinburgh shaped the moral environment of the city in subtle ways. Bodies were known to be valuable. Grave robbing was feared but also treated as a professional nuisance rather than a moral crisis. The poor understood, dimly or clearly, that their bodies were not entirely theirs even in death. This knowledge created fatalism. It also created opportunity. A body taken from a grave represented labor and risk. A body taken from a lodging house represented efficiency. The Westport, positioned close enough to Surgeon Square for transport to be quick, became geographically useful. The proximity between lodging house poverty and medical instruction was not accidental. It was structural. The city placed its vulnerable populations close to the institutions that required their remains. Domestic labor as concealment. In the Westport, domestic labor did not cease because life was harsh. It intensified. People cleaned, cooked, and repaired because disorder could escalate quickly into danger. When murders occurred inside lodging houses, this labor became concealment. Bedding was changed. Floors were scrubbed. Clothing disappeared. Smells were managed. Stories were told. Women were central to this work because women were assigned to it. This assignment did not make them innocent or guilty by default. It made them necessary. A murder committed in a clean room could look like an illness. A murder committed in a disorderly room could look like chaos. Order was protection. Why the Westport mattered. The Westport did not simply host the murders. It made them possible by normalizing conditions that masked violence, transience, drink, domestic crowding, selective attention, and the quiet sorting of human worth. When later commentators asked how so many people could be killed without immediate detection, they often framed the question as moral failure. How could neighbors not know? How could women not scream? How could no one intervene? These questions misunderstand the environment. Knowledge and response are not the same. Awareness does not automatically translate into action when action carries cost. The Westport taught people to endure, to look away, to prioritize survival over justice. Burke and Hare learned to operate inside that lesson. Helen McDougal and Margaret Hare did not invent the Westport's conditions. They lived within them. Their roles, one mobile, one fixed, mapped onto the geography of the area. McDougal moved through lodging spaces with Burke. Margaret anchored one such space as operator. Together, they represent the two ways women inhabited the underbelly, as partners in drift, and as managers of place. The murders escalated because the environment allowed escalation. They continued because profit flowed and detection lagged. They ended not because the system failed, but because it faltered briefly, under the weight of one body too visible, one household too strained, one silence broken. The next chapter turns to the broader system that transformed these deaths into money, the anatomy trade itself. Without that demand, the Westport murders would have remained isolated acts of violence. With it, they became production. Chapter 6: The Anatomy Trade. Edinburgh in the early 19th century prided itself on intellect. It was a city that marketed learning as identity: lecture theatres, medical colleges, private classes, printed treatises, professional societies. In that world, anatomy was not a marginal curiosity. It was central to training and prestige. Surgeons were made by cutting. Physicians were legitimized by knowledge of the body's interior. Students were taught that accuracy required contact with flesh. That requirement created a problem that polite society preferred to treat as technical rather than moral. Bodies were needed, and the lawful supply was limited. The resulting market was not peripheral to the city's life. It ran through it quietly, like a second bloodstream, unacknowledged when convenient, defended when challenged, and sustained through a chain of decisions that allowed respectable men to benefit from disreputable acts. This market did not begin with Burke and Hare. It preceded them. It shaped the conditions that made their crimes profitable. It also shaped the way the crimes were interpreted and resolved. Demand, education built on scarcity. Anatomy teaching required cadavers. Not illustrations. Not models. Bodies. The legal sources of bodies were small. Executed criminals could be dissected, but executions were not frequent enough to supply the growing medical schools. Laws and custom restricted the treatment of the dead in ways that preserved dignity for some and uncertainty for others. A body belonged, in social imagination, to kin and to God. Anatomy required that imagination to bend. As Edinburgh's medical training expanded, the gap between demand and lawful supply widened. Students multiplied. Private anatomy classes proliferated. Demonstrations required repeated examples. A single body could teach only so much before it decomposed. Cadavers were not durable resources. They were perishable. Scarcity shaped the market's ethics. When demand is framed as necessity, questions about supply become inconveniences. A shortage becomes a reason to solve the problem rather than reconsider it. The city's medical establishment treated access to bodies as an educational right. The dead poor became the easiest material to convert into that right. Supply, the dead poor as the obvious resource. Not all bodies were equally reachable. Families with money protected their dead through burial practices, private cemeteries, and social status that made interference risky. The poor did not have those protections. They were buried quickly, often with minimal ceremony, sometimes in communal grounds. Their graves could be shallow. Their kin might be absent. Their names might be recorded poorly or not at all. This did not mean the poor did not care about their dead. It meant they lacked the means to defend them. This inequality created the supply chain. The dead poor were more accessible. They were also easier to rationalize as educational material because society already treated them as less fully protected in life. The logic was cruelly consistent. If the poor could be neglected while alive, they could be exploited while dead. This is one reason the Westport murders targeted the poor. Profit lay in converting the least defended bodies into the most valuable commodity in the anatomy economy. The resurrection men and the normalization of theft. Before Burke and Hare, the dominant supply method was grave robbing. The resurrection men operated as specialists, organized, nocturnal, skilled at rapid exhumation. They learned cemetery routines. They bribed watchmen or avoided them. They used tools designed for speed. They left coffins damaged but not necessarily obviously violated at first glance. This trade was widely known and widely feared. It produced riots, vigilante patrols, and protective measures such as heavy stone slabs, iron cages, guards, and watch houses. It also produced something else: normalization. When a practice is common enough, outrage becomes routine. People complain, defend their dead as best they can, and then return to daily survival. Authorities may condemn the practice publicly while tolerating it privately because it serves a professional need. Medical teachers might insist they did not ask questions about the origins of bodies while consistently purchasing bodies that could only have come from illegal sources. This is the moral posture that made Burke and Hare's later sales possible. The market was already trained not to look too closely. Buyers and distance. the respectability of not knowing. The anatomy market depended on distance. Bodies did not move themselves. Someone had to procure them, transport them, deliver them, negotiate payment. Someone had to handle the risk. The buyers could then place themselves at the end of the chain and claim ignorance of the beginning. The claim of ignorance was socially useful. It allowed respectable men to keep hands clean while benefiting from what dirty hands provided. It also allowed the city to pretend that the trade's violence was accidental rather than structural. In practice, the claim of ignorance strains under repetition. A buyer who accepts an unusually fresh body repeatedly, delivered by the same men, without asking questions, is not innocent. He is complicit in the market's blindness. This is not a legal conclusion. It is a social reality. Why Burke and Hare were different. The key innovation Burke and Hare brought to the anatomy market was not the concept of selling bodies. It was efficiency. A body taken from a grave is risky to obtain and carries signs of burial. A body taken from a lodging house is immediate. It can be delivered within hours. It is cleaner. It can arrive looking like death by drink or illness. It avoids the labor of digging and the risk of being caught at a cemetery. This difference mattered to anatomy teachers. Fresh bodies were better teaching material. They decomposed less. They were easier to dissect. They preserved anatomical detail. A steady supply of fresh bodies could transform a private anatomy operation. From the seller's standpoint, the same efficiency meant increased profit. If procuring a body required digging, it required time and coordination. If procuring a body required murder inside a room, it required only control and silence. Control and silence were plentiful in the West Port. The economics of the body. In the world Burke and Hare entered, bodies had prices. The precise sums varied, but the principle was stable. A cadaver could yield more cash quickly than many forms of honest labor. That alone would have drawn men already accustomed to short-term wages and hard work. Once the first sale was successful, it demonstrated not only possibility but reward. The anatomy market did not ask for paperwork. It did not require proof of identity. It did not require documentation of death. It required only a body delivered in usable condition. That requirement shaped victim selection. The sellers needed bodies that would not draw immediate attention and that could be delivered without obvious injury. The easiest victims were those already socially discounted and those whose deaths could be interpreted as natural or drink-related. Women, the elderly, the sick, and the marginal were profitable not because they were weaker in a simplistic sense, but because their disappearances were less likely to disrupt the market. The anatomy trade thus turned social inequality into commercial advantage. The complicity of the city. It is tempting to place all responsibility on a few men, Burke and Hare as monsters, a single anatomist as villainous buyer, a handful of associates as accessories. That framing comforts the reader. It isolates evil. It spares the city. The reality is broader. The anatomy market was sustained by the city's professional ambition. Edinburgh wanted to be a medical capital. Students wanted training. Teachers wanted reputation. Surgeons wanted skill. Bodies were the raw material. When raw material is scarce, a market does not simply shrink. It searches. The search found the poor. The poor understood this and responded with fear. Their fear was rational. It was not superstition. It was an awareness that their bodies were valuable to people who did not value their lives. This fear created a social background against which the West Port murders became especially terrifying. The crimes did not introduce the idea that the poor could be turned into anatomy specimens. They confirmed it. Women in the anatomy economy. Women are often positioned as irrelevant to the anatomy trade because the formal institutions were male. Medical teaching was dominated by men. Professional authority was male. Buyers and lecturers were male. Students were overwhelmingly male. Yet women were not absent. They appeared as widows who depended on lodging house income and therefore depended on passing bodies through rooms. Partners who shared the profits of sale. Domestic workers who cleaned the spaces where bodies were prepared. Neighbors who saw bodies transported or heard stories. Mothers and daughters who feared burial violation and organized watch. Victims whose bodies became educational material. The anatomy economy did not require women to be professional participants. It required them to exist within the domestic spaces that enabled procurement and concealment. This is where Helen McDougal and Margaret Hare belong in the anatomy chapter. Their lives were shaped by domestic economies. Those domestic economies became procurement networks. Their labor, whether active, passive, coerced, or opportunistic, sat in the pipeline between vulnerable people and professional buyers. The anatomy trade is therefore not merely background. It is the system into which their household lives were absorbed. Dr. Knox and the question of knowledge. The buyer most associated with the Burke and Hare murders is Dr. Robert Knox, an anatomist whose teaching and private classes benefited from the bodies delivered. He became the emblem of professional distance, the respectable man who profited from disreputable supply. The key question in assessing Knox's role has always been knowledge. Did he know the bodies were murdered? Did he suspect? Did he refuse to ask? The record does not permit certainty on motive. It does permit observation on pattern. The pattern is this: Burke and Hare delivered bodies in unusually fresh condition, repeatedly, over a relatively short period. The bodies were taken without the typical marks of burial. The supply was regular enough to become noticeable. The sellers were not established resurrection men. They were laborers and lodging house operators. Even without explicit confession, the pattern should have raised questions. Yet the market structure rewarded those who did not insist on answers. Questions could interrupt supply. Supply meant profit and teaching success. The system therefore encouraged a posture of convenient ignorance. Knox's later reputation suffered because the public needed a respectable figure to blame alongside the obvious murderers. The case threatened not only personal safety but civic pride. Edinburgh's medical prestige had been fed, literally, by murder. That fact required management. Punishing Burke was one form of management. Discrediting Knox was another. Neither addressed the deeper system, the city's willingness to rely on the dead poor for professional advancement. Fear spreads, the poor as potential stock. As rumors grew, fear spread quickly through the same networks that had always sustained Westport survival: lodgers warning lodgers, neighbors watching stairwells, people avoiding certain houses, women cautioning daughters, men warning travelers. Fear moved through taverns as quickly as through churches. This fear was not simply of murder. It was fear of conversion, fear that a person could cease to be a person and become a commodity. It was fear that a poor death would not even grant the protection of burial. That fear sharpened the public's need for spectacle once the case broke. An execution offered reassurance. A dissection offered symbolic reversal. If the poor had been taken for anatomy, then the murderer would be taken for anatomy. The law could not dismantle the anatomy market. It could, however, perform a moment of justice within it. The anatomy trade as motive, method, and multiplier. Without the anatomy trade, the murders would likely have been fewer. A market turns violence into routine by attaching payment to repetition. It also turns repetition into a kind of work, profit-driven, procedural, detached from personal grievance. The murders did not depend on hatred. They depended on demand. This is what makes them so chilling and so modern in their logic. The victims were not chosen because they wronged the perpetrators. They were chosen because they could be converted into money quickly and safely. A city that normalized a black market in bodies created the conditions for a black market in death. Closing, the system tightens. By late 1828, Burke and Hare's deliveries had become suspicious not only in their volume but in their boldness. They were no longer merely supplying occasional bodies. They were generating supply at a rate that could not remain invisible. The lodging houses that enabled this production were under strain. The need for victims pressured them into higher risk selections. The routine demanded constant management, of neighbors, of other lodgers, of suspicion, of noise, of bodies. This pressure would not end through gradual reform. It would end through error, a moment when the domestic concealment failed and outsiders saw what they were not meant to see. Chapter 7: The First Death. Donald the Pensioner. The first death in the Westport story was not, strictly speaking, murder. That distinction has always mattered to people trying to understand how the killings began, because it allows a beginning that feels less monstrous. A man dies naturally, money is owed, a bad decision is made, and a line is crossed almost by accident. The comfort of that framing is obvious. It suggests that what followed was a drift rather than a choice. Yet the event that opened the door was not the death itself. It was the response to it. What mattered was the discovery that a human body could be converted into cash quickly, locally, and with minimal immediate consequence. Once that discovery was made inside a lodging house, the moral landscape changed. Donald as lodger. Donald is generally described as an elderly man, a pensioner, someone living at the edge of stable survival. He was the sort of person lodging houses depended upon and also resented, dependable when payments arrived, burdensome when illness delayed them. He belonged to a class of men who had outlived steady work but had not acquired security, older bodies still occupying space, still needing warmth and drink, still trying to maintain independence in a city that did not reward it. In a lodging house, an older lodger could be treated as a fixture. People learned his habits. They learnt when he drank, when he slept, when he came and went. Familiarity might create a form of tolerance, but it rarely created protection. It created predictability. Predictability can be exploited. Donald's death was inconvenient, not tragic, in the first calculations made by those who ran the house. That does not mean they felt nothing. It means that in a setting governed by rent, food, and debt, the practical consequences of death arrive quickly and demand immediate attention. An elderly lodger who dies owing rent leaves behind a small crisis. The debt does not disappear. The bedding must be cleaned or replaced. The room must be reopened for paying lodgers. A burial must be arranged, or the body must be surrendered to whatever local arrangements exist for the poor dead. All of this costs money and time. For a household already close to collapse, this can feel like disaster. Debt and the lodging house economy. A lodging house is not only a place where people sleep. It is a small financial system. Rent is collected. Drink is sold. Food is shared. Credit is extended reluctantly and collected aggressively. A landlady's survival depends on turning bodies into income, living bodies, paying bodies. Death interrupts that flow. It also produces a short-term threat. Other lodgers notice a corpse. They ask questions. They might leave if the house feels unsafe or if the atmosphere becomes unpleasant. The presence of death can weaken trade. In more stable households, death could be managed with ceremony and kin support. In the Westport lodging economy, death had to be managed as quickly as possible. This is where Donald's pension becomes significant. He was expected to receive money. He died before it arrived. That meant he died not only owing rent, but holding the promise of imminent payment. In a household that measures survival in days, an expected payment is not abstract. It is planned upon. It becomes part of the week's calculations. When Donald died, the house lost that payment and still faced its expenses. The temptation to recover value from the dead is not unique to this case. It exists wherever poverty makes death financially dangerous. What makes the Burke and Hare case distinctive is the existence of a ready buyer. The discovery of a buyer. The anatomy trade in Edinburgh was not invisible. The shortage of lawful cadavers was widely understood. Grave robbing had become a public anxiety. Protective measures were taken in cemeteries. There were rumors, stories, warnings, and occasional riots. People spoke of resurrection men, as though they were both criminals and tradesmen. In that atmosphere, the idea that a dead body had monetary value was not unimaginable. What was often missing was access, knowing who would buy, where to take a body, what price could be paid, and how to move a corpse without detection. Burke and Hare did not create the market. They found their way into it. The lodging house already taught them how to manage bodies, intoxicated bodies, sick bodies, sleeping bodies. The anatomy market taught them that the dead body, handled quickly, could become income. The first sale demonstrated that the chain could function end to end. A body could be transported from the Westport to an anatomy buyer. Payment could be received. No immediate police response followed. The city did not descend on the lodging house. The household did not collapse. Life continued. This was the real beginning, the proof that the transaction worked. The first act of concealment. To sell a body that dies naturally still requires concealment, because the lawful handling of death for the poor involves scrutiny and process, parish arrangements, burial practices, and the attention of neighbors. Even when death is expected, a corpse moved in the wrong way provokes questions. The first sale therefore demanded planning. Donald's body had to be kept until it could be moved. It had to be hidden from other lodgers or explained to them in a way that did not prompt alarm. It had to be transported through streets where watchmen might be present. It had to be delivered to people who would accept it. The body also had to be stripped of identifying evidence that could later connect it to the house if questions were asked. In such sales, clothing mattered. Clothing was property. Clothing could be recognized. Clothing could be sold separately. It could also be evidence. This is where the lodging house women become relevant even at the earliest stage. Clothing is managed inside domestic space. Bedding is handled. Rooms are cleaned. The ordinary domestic labor of a house intersects with the extraordinary act of moving a corpse. The record does not preserve each step in Donald's case in modern investigative detail. It does not need to. The logic is clear enough. Even a natural death sold into anatomy is not simple. It requires the household to cooperate with concealment. Cooperation can take many forms. It can be active. It can be silent. It can be coerced. It can also be pragmatic, a household acting as one unit because survival requires the unit to hold. Once that cooperation exists, it becomes easier to demand it again. Profit and the shift in moral imagination. The first sale taught a lesson about money. A laborer earns by exhausting himself for wages that can disappear. A lodging house operator earns by collecting small sums from vulnerable people. A body sale produces a larger sum in one transaction. It collapses time. It turns days or weeks of labor into an immediate payment. That kind of payment does something to a person's moral imagination. It does not automatically transform them into a killer. It does introduce a new possibility, the idea that money can be extracted not only from the living but from the dead, and that the dead can be produced as well as found. This possibility becomes more seductive when the people involved already live in a world where the poor are treated as disposable. If the city's professional class is willing to buy stolen bodies, then the moral injury has already been distributed. The sellers can tell themselves that they are merely supplying what the city demands. This justification is not necessary for murder. It is useful for sustaining it. The step from sale to killing. After Donald, the narrative shifts quickly in later retellings. One death leads to another, opportunism becomes routine, and soon bodies are being made for sale. The speed of this shift is often treated as evidence of inherent depravity. It can also be understood as evidence of environment. Burke and Hare operated within a domestic setting already designed to handle vulnerable people. They did not have to abduct victims. They did not have to travel far. They had access to a steady flow of lodgers and visitors. They had privacy and noise cover. They had alcohol to reduce resistance. They had a buyer who rewarded speed and freshness. When opportunity aligns with method, escalation becomes easier. The first deliberate killings that followed Donald were made possible by a simple realization: a dead lodger did not have to arrive by chance. He could be encouraged into intoxication and then prevented from waking. The method later associated with the pair, restraint and suffocation, reflects that environment. It is a method suited to small rooms and shared walls. It produces minimal visible injury. It can be framed as death by drink, illness, or collapse. It is efficient. It is also intimate. It requires proximity and control. A lodging house provides both. The role of women at the threshold. At the earliest stage, before the killing sequence became public scandal, the women connected to the household occupied positions that were simultaneously ordinary and pivotal. A lodging house woman's labor is constant: cleaning, preparing bedding, serving drink, managing quarrels, handling neighbors, maintaining the surface of respectability necessary to keep trade flowing. This labor is typically invisible in historical records because it is not treated as action. It is treated as background. In crimes conducted indoors, background becomes mechanism. A woman present in the house can reduce suspicion. A visitor offered drink in a room where a woman is present may feel safer. Other lodgers hearing noise may assume ordinary domestic disturbance rather than violence. A body moved through a room where domestic tasks continue can be hidden in plain sight. These factors do not prove criminal intent. They explain how domestic space can be weaponized. Donald's case is the first point at which the women's importance becomes structurally clear. A corpse sold from a lodging house is not merely a male enterprise. It passes through the domestic domain where women work. It demands silence in places where women are present. It demands management of clothing, bedding, and story, all tasks lodged in the domestic sphere. The murders that followed depended on that same sphere. An early warning embedded in the first sale. The first sale contained a warning that was ignored because it was not yet audible as danger. A body left the lodging house and entered a professional institution. Money returned. No questions were asked that mattered. No authorities intervened. The transaction succeeded because the buyer did not insist on lawful origins and because the community did not have the means or the will to investigate the disappearance of a poor lodger. This success communicated something to the sellers: the city systems could be navigated. The poor dead were already halfway unprotected. The lesson was not merely that bodies could be sold. It was that bodies could be sold without consequences. That is the kind of lesson that can turn a one-time act into a business model. The business model of murder. To call the murders a business is not to diminish their violence. It is to recognize their logic. A business model requires a reliable source of supply, a method of conversion, a buyer willing to pay, concealment that prevents interruption, internal cooperation or control. In the Westport, all five existed. Supply came from poverty, transience, drink, and isolation. Conversion came from indoor control and suffocation. The buyer existed in the anatomy trade. Concealment was provided by the lodging house environment. Internal cooperation was produced by household entanglement, partners bound by money, living space, and shared risk. Donald's death is the moment when the model's first link was tested. It held. Once it held, the remaining links could be strengthened. What Donald's death reveals about the victims to come. Donald's status as a pensioner points to a larger truth about who became vulnerable. Pensioners, the elderly poor, and the chronically ill existed in a fragile zone. They were not fully anonymous. They might be known in the neighborhood. Yet their lives were not protected by robust kin networks or by institutions designed to intervene quickly. Their deaths could be explained away. Their disappearances could be delayed in recognition. In lodging house environments, such people could be treated as movable objects, bodies that took up space, bodies that could be managed, bodies that could be turned into income. The shift from seeing a person as a lodger to seeing them as a commodity is not sudden. It begins with small acts of dehumanization, annoyance at debt, impatience with illness, resentment at dependency. Donald's death, handled as an economic problem first, contained that shift in embryo. The household after the first sale. After a first successful transaction, a household does not necessarily become murderous overnight. It does become altered. Silence becomes shared. Guilt becomes distributed. Profit becomes tasted. The household's internal dynamic can shift, because the secret creates leverage. A person who knows can be controlled by the fear of exposure. A person who benefits can be bound by money. A person who is uncertain can be kept uncertain. The secret becomes a domestic force. This is where the women's position becomes even more precarious. If a woman in the household understood that a body had been sold, she also understood that leaving could expose her to danger, poverty, retaliation, accusation. Remaining could feel safer in the short term, even as it increased entanglement. Entanglement is not the same as innocence. It is not the same as guilt. It is the condition in which many crimes become sustainable. The line hardens. Donald's death could have remained an isolated act of desecration. A natural death sold for money. A one-time solution to a one-time crisis. Instead, it became the first proof that a body could be turned into cash efficiently. The second proof, the one that would shift the case fully into murder, would come when a person who did not need to die was made to die, and when the killing was treated not as a crisis but as a method. The Westport story is often told as a descent. In practice, it is better understood as a series of thresholds crossed under pressure and then normalized. Donald's death was the first threshold. It did not create monsters. It created a workable procedure. Once a workable procedure exists, the only remaining question is how far it will be used before it breaks, through error, through exhaustion, or through a victim whose absence is noticed too quickly. Chapter 8. Helen's complicity begins. After Donald, the first sale was no longer an aberration. It was a demonstrated method. The lodging house world is a place where methods spread quickly, not through written instruction but through practical success. A man sees money arrive without immediate consequence. He learns what can be done. He learns, more dangerously, what can be repeated. The Westport murders are often described as a sudden escalation, one body sold, then another, then many. In reality, the shift from opportunism to intentional killing required something more than greed. It required domestic stability, an environment where repeated violence could be conducted, managed and concealed. That environment was a household. Households are not merely collections of people. They are systems of dependency and habit. They produce routines and silences. They distribute labor. They create obligations. They also create vulnerabilities, a partner who knows too much, a woman who sees too much, a lodger who hears too much. In the Burke and Hare case, complicity did not begin in a single theatrical moment. It began when the household accepted a procedure and adapted itself to sustain it. Helen McDougal's complicity begins here, not as a moral verdict, but as a structural condition. The question is not whether she decided, in a dramatic instant, to become part of murder. The question is how a woman living inside the domestic space where bodies were being sold could continue to live there as the sales turned into killings. Complicity begins when a person's life becomes organized around a secret. Complicity is not always an act. Legal narratives tend to treat complicity as a series of discrete actions. A woman restrains a victim, a woman holds a door, a woman hands over a pillow. Those acts can occur. They can also be absent. Complicity in domestic crime often looks different. It can take the form of not asking questions that would force a decision, repeating routines that make the environment feel normal, participating in the household economy that profits from crime, managing the domestic consequences of violence, defending the household story when outsiders intrude, remaining in place when leaving would disrupt the operation. These forms are less visible, and therefore less frequently narrated. Yet they are precisely the forms most available to women whose power is domestic rather than physical. For Helen McDougal, the problem is that the record is not designed to capture this kind of complicity. Courts capture acts that can be stated plainly. Domestic life captures the conditions that make those acts possible. A woman can be integral to the conditions and still emerge from the record as present. The domestic environment as a trap. Cohabiting partnerships in poverty can become traps without becoming prisons. A woman may be physically able to walk away and still be practically unable to leave without severe cost. That cost is not abstract. It includes loss of shelter, loss of shared income, exposure to violence from a partner who fears betrayal, loss of reputation in a neighborhood where reputation governs survival, intensified vulnerability to exploitation by others, hunger, illness, arrest, institutionalization. None of these costs make a woman innocent. They explain why remaining is sometimes chosen over escape, even when the environment becomes dangerous. In the Westport murders, a further pressure exists. Once a body has been sold, everyone in the household carries risk. If the secret is exposed, the household collapses. The collapse will not distribute suffering evenly. In a world where women are less believed and more easily judged, the woman can become a convenient scapegoat even when she did not commit the fatal act. This reality shapes survival behavior. A woman may remain not because she agrees, but because she calculates that leaving will not save her. It may simply change the form of her danger. The shift from concealment to facilitation. After the first sale, concealment becomes routine. Routine concealment changes the household's internal roles. A murder household requires certain things to keep functioning. Victims must be brought in without alarm. Other residents must not intervene. Noise must be managed. The space must be cleaned and reset. Stories must be consistent. Money must be shared or controlled. Outsiders must be reassured or turned away. Within those requirements, women often become facilitators not by stepping into male violence, but by intensifying female labor. Hospitality becomes more deliberate. Domestic order becomes more urgent. Conversations become more controlled. This is how complicity can begin without a single defining act. A woman continues to pour drink. She continues to make space. She continues to speak in the tone that keeps other people calm. She continues to manage the domestic surface that makes everything else possible. In a crime like this, the domestic surface is not incidental. It is the cover under which killing becomes repeatable. Helen's proximity, what it means. Helen McDougal lived with Burke during the murder period. That fact alone is heavy. To live with a man who is repeatedly involved in murder is to be exposed to changes in money flow, changes in routine and mood, changes in the handling of strangers, secrecy that intensifies and becomes habitual, Domestic disruption followed by deliberate restoration. The physical presence of the dead. Even if every killing was done by men, a woman living in the space would encounter the consequences. It is difficult to imagine repeated killings occurring inside a household without the woman noticing something. The absence of people who entered, the repeated need to move bodies, the sudden delivery of money, the tension around outsiders, the specific rules about which rooms were used and when. This is why public suspicion attached so quickly to McDougal. People may not have known what she did. They could not accept that she did nothing. The public was not wrong to find her presence meaningful. Where the public went wrong was in turning meaning into certainty. Domestic credibility and female cover. A lodging house murder scheme relies on credibility. Victims must feel safe enough to enter. Neighbors must feel uninterested enough not to intervene. Other lodgers must feel accustomed enough not to ask. Female presence can provide credibility in ways male presence cannot. A woman offering drink can be read as social. A man offering drink can be read as predatory. A woman in the room can lower suspicion for another woman. A woman managing the house can create the impression of ordinary domestic life even when violence is happening behind a door. This is not a romanticized view of women as naturally harmless. It is a social fact of the period. Women were assumed to be less dangerous, and that assumption could be weaponized. If Helen participated at all, even passively, her participation would be valuable precisely because it took advantage of gendered expectations. A household economy that changes shape. Money changes households. After the anatomy sales began, the household economy likely shifted in ways that were noticeable even to people outside the partnership. There would be more drinking, more spending, more movement, more confidence, or conversely more paranoia. Sudden money in a poor household rarely produces calm. It produces volatility. This volatility can be a clue. In many true crime cases, households that profit from crime become unstable because the crime's proceeds do not resolve poverty's underlying stresses. Money arrives, is spent quickly, and disappears. Drink intensifies. Quarrels erupt. The household becomes louder, more chaotic, more suspicious. Such volatility would have affected Helen directly. A partner's violence and mood swings in a household already shaped by alcohol can create conditions where compliance is the simplest survival strategy. Again, this does not absolve. It explains. When knowledge becomes a burden. At a certain point, knowledge becomes active even if a person does nothing. Knowing that murder is occurring changes every decision. Whether to speak to a neighbor. Whether to warn a lodger. Whether to leave and risk being blamed. Whether to stay and become more implicated. Whether to refuse participation and risk violence. Whether to accept money and become bound. In such conditions, silence is not merely the absence of speech. It is a choice made under pressure. Silence can be cowardice. Silence can be strategy. Silence can be coerced. Silence can also be the only available tool when every option leads to danger. Helen's likely path into deeper complicity, if it occurred, would have been paved not by a single moment of cruelty but by repeated decisions to remain silent, repeated acts of ordinary domestic maintenance, and repeated acceptance of a household economy whose source could no longer be plausibly denied. The early murders as rhythm. As killings began to repeat, they would have acquired a rhythm. This rhythm is important because it reveals the murders as routine rather than passion. A typical sequence would involve: a vulnerable person is identified. Alcohol is offered and encouraged. The person is kept in the house. The person is isolated from others. The person is killed quietly. The body is moved and delivered. Payment is received. The household returns to normal appearance. Every step relies on domestic control. Every step becomes easier with practice. Helen's role, whether active or passive, would have been bound to this rhythm. She would be present in the house as the steps occurred. She would be part of the normalization afterward. She would share space with the men who carried out the acts. She would likely benefit from the money. She would likely drink. She would likely fight. She would likely negotiate survival inside a household that had crossed into a new moral world. In that sense, complicity becomes not an isolated deed but an environment. The psychological question that cannot be answered cleanly. Readers often want motive. They want to know what Helen felt, and whether she believed the victims deserved it, whether she was terrified, whether she was cruel, whether she was numb. The record does not allow certainty here. Any attempt to assign a precise inner life risks turning her into fiction. What can be described is the plausible psychological landscape of domestic entanglement in violent crime. The gradual normalization of extreme acts. The narrowing of moral imagination under financial pressure. The use of alcohol to blur guilt and memory. The shifting of responsibility onto the partner who performs the killing. The creation of justifications based on necessity or inevitability. The fear of retaliation if the secret is betrayed. These are not excuses. They are patterns seen repeatedly when ordinary people become involved in repeated crime. Helen's complicity, if it deepened, likely deepened through these patterns rather than through ideology or sadism. Where this chapter ends. By the time the murders entered their killing season, the household had crossed into a state where death was not exceptional. It was productive. The bodies delivered to anatomy buyers were not accidents. They were outputs. This transformation could not have occurred without domestic stability sufficient to repeat the process. That stability was produced in part by women whose labor kept the house functioning and whose silence kept it sealed. Helen McDougal's complicity begins, therefore, not with a single provable act of violence, but with her continued presence inside a household that had learned to convert vulnerable life into money and to treat the domestic sphere as a killing space. Chapter 9. The Killing Season. Once the Westport murders became repeatable, they ceased to look like crime in the way the law prefers to imagine crime. They did not unfold as singular, extraordinary events punctuated by remorse or panic. They unfolded as routine. Routine is what makes the case distinct. It is what makes it horrifying. It is also what makes it difficult to write about honestly without drifting into spectacle. The killings were not theatrical. They were procedural. They took place inside rooms that still had to be cleaned, inside households that still had to eat, inside neighborhoods that still had to function. This chapter follows the murders as a season rather than a sequence of sensational scenes, a period of intensified production driven by money, enabled by domestic control, and sustained by the city's willingness to accept bodies without insisting on their lawful origin. Killing season is not a metaphor. It is a description of how murder can become labor when the victims are socially discounted and the proceeds are immediate. Escalation as pattern, not rupture. After the first sale demonstrated profit and safety, escalation required only one additional condition: confidence. Confidence grows quickly when nothing interrupts a successful method. In the Westport case, the absence of interruption came from multiple sources. Victims were poor and often unprotected by immediate kin networks. Lodging house transients normalized disappearance. Intoxication normalized collapse. The anatomy buyer provided steady payment. The murders occurred indoors with minimal visible injury. Neighbors learned to ignore noise and disorder. These conditions allowed the killers to treat each death as a repeatable unit rather than as a crisis. The killings therefore did not escalate because the men suddenly discovered they enjoyed murder. They escalated because the system rewarded repetition. Once murder becomes rewarded and remains undisrupted, it becomes more likely to continue. How victims were found. Victims did not have to be hunted far afield. Edinburgh's poor were already concentrated in the same streets and closes that produced lodging house life. People arrived daily from rural districts, from other towns, from Ireland. Some were in the city for work. Some were in the city seeking charity. Some were simply in motion because motion was their default state. The murderer's most valuable skill was not violence. It was assessment. A viable victim was someone who could be brought indoors without raising immediate alarm and whose absence would not quickly trigger pursuit. This assessment relied on ordinary observation. Does the person speak of family nearby? Are they traveling alone? Do they have regular work and regular contacts? Are they already intoxicated or easily intoxicated? Would anyone expect them home that night? Are they known enough that their disappearance will be noticed quickly? The answers did not need to be certain. They needed only to be safe enough. A lodging house is full of people who are safe enough to disappear. Women were especially vulnerable within this logic because many women on the margins moved between lodgings, casual work, and relationships that were not socially recognized as protective. A woman could vanish and be interpreted as having moved to another street, another man, another town. The same was true of the elderly poor and the chronically ill, whose deaths could be attributed to weakness without suspicion. The domestic method. The method attributed to Burke and Hare is often described as burking, a combination of suffocation and restraint that leaves limited external injury. This is not a dramatic killing method. It is an efficient one. It requires close physical control, a confined space, a victim whose resistance is reduced by drink or weakness, quick coordination between perpetrators, minimal noise. It is ideally suited to a lodging house environment. It is the opposite of street violence. It does not require weapons. It does not require bloodshed. It does not risk attracting attention through screams or visible injury. It also produces bodies that appear good for anatomy, fresh, not decomposed, not visibly damaged. Once the killers understood that this method could be repeated with little immediate consequence, it became a procedure. The role of drink in repetition. Alcohol served 3 repeating functions. It made victims easier to control. It provided a plausible narrative of collapse. It reduced the killer's own inhibition and facilitated denial. In many violent households, alcohol does not merely accompany crime. It sustains it by blurring memory and responsibility. A person who drinks heavily can tell himself he was not fully himself. A person who witnesses crime while intoxicated can tell herself she does not know what she saw. In a lodging house murder economy, drink becomes part of the machinery. Women were not merely bystanders to this machinery. Women often dispensed alcohol, encouraged it, and participated in the drinking culture. In such environments, the boundary between ordinary hospitality and deliberate incapacitation is difficult to observe from outside. That difficulty is part of what made the killings sustainable. Routine concealment. After each killing, the household had to reset. Resetting did not require elaborate forensic awareness. It required only ordinary domestic labor performed quickly and repeatedly. Bedding rearranged, cleaned, or replaced. Clothing removed and hidden or sold. Cups, bottles, and food cleared. Bloodlessness exploited, less staining, less obvious evidence. Stories rehearsed, the victim left, the victim moved on, the victim was drunk and wandered out. The lack of blood and visible injury mattered. Blood forces attention. Blood demands questions. Suffocation allows a death to appear quiet, even after it has happened. This quietness is central to the case's continuation. It allowed murders to occur in a crowded neighborhood without producing immediate scandal. Payment and the psychology of profit. The anatomy payments created a cycle. A body was delivered. Money returned. Money was spent. The household's poverty temporarily eased. Then the money vanished into drink, lodging costs, and daily survival. This cycle produces a particular psychological dynamic, the sense that money is always just one more job away. If murder becomes the fastest job, it becomes tempting to repeat it whenever money runs out. This is how profit-driven crime becomes repetitive without being strategic in the long term. There is no savings, no stable improvement, only a repeated conversion of life into cash to fund the immediate present. Within such a cycle, moral boundaries erode not through philosophical reasoning but through repetition. A person can do almost anything repeatedly if each repetition feels like solving the same short-term problem: rent due, drink wanted, hunger present, comfort needed. The women during the season. In killing season narratives, women are often either erased or turned into dramatic archetypes. The domestic reality is more disturbing. Women can sit inside the same room where violence is routine and continue to perform the tasks that keep the household functioning. Helen McDougal's likely involvement during this period sits on a spectrum. The surviving record does not allow a definitive placement, but the structural pressures are clear. She lived with Burke. She shared accommodation where murders occurred or were planned around. She was present in the social environment that delivered victims. She benefited from the household economy. She did not remove herself from the household. Margaret Hare's likely involvement is shaped by premises. Her house was a key site where victims were brought. Her role as landlady's wife positioned her to manage lodgers. She was present in the domestic routines of concealment. She benefited materially from the household's income. Even if both women avoided the fatal act itself, their domestic labor would have been part of the operation's stability. Crime conducted indoors is not sustained only by the act of killing. It is sustained by the management of everything around the act. This is where the silent nature of female involvement becomes structurally important. Domestic labor does not announce itself. It leaves fewer dramatic moments to quote. It can therefore be ignored by later narrators and still remain essential to what happened. Why the season did not end earlier. With repetition comes risk. Yet the murders continued. The question is why. Several forces delayed detection. Victims were not centrally registered. Many were unknown to authorities. Disappearances among the poor were common enough to be dismissed. The killings occurred indoors with minimal visible injury. Bodies were removed quickly, reducing the chance of discovery. The anatomy buyer's acceptance removed the need to conceal bodies long-term. Community reluctance to involve police reduced early reporting. The perpetrators could blame illness, drink, or travel for absences. In addition, the killers likely underestimated the cumulative effect of repetition. One missing person can be dismissed. Many missing people create pattern. Pattern attracts attention. The danger was not in any single killing. It was in the accumulation. When a crime becomes routine, the perpetrators often become careless. Carelessness is not always dramatic. It can be subtle. Choosing a victim more visible than usual. Killing when other lodgers are nearby. Misjudging how suspicious a neighbor has become. Becoming louder, more drunk, more reckless. Assuming that silence will always hold. The Westport murders ended because the routine eventually demanded a mistake. The victims as moral indictment of the system. The killings targeted people who were already treated as disposable. That disposability is not merely a background tragedy. It is central to how the murders could continue. The poor were vulnerable not only to murderers but to the city's institutions. They lacked protections that would have made their absence urgent. They lacked reputations that demanded inquiry. They lacked the social standing that could make a buyer hesitate. The anatomy trade therefore did not merely profit from the deaths. It profited from the victims' social invisibility. It transformed that invisibility into revenue and educational prestige. This is what makes the case more than a story of two men killing. It is a story of a city willing to accept bodies without demanding to know whose lives were ended to provide them. The tightening net. By the later stage of the killing season, pressure would have been building inside the household. Repetition strains domestic stability. It creates paranoia. It produces conflict. It requires increasing control over outsiders. It increases the number of people who have seen something suspicious, heard something odd, noticed an absence. A lodging house is not an isolated laboratory. It is porous. It depends on constant interaction with strangers. Every new victim is also a new risk because each victim brings connections, however thin, that can later pull at the household secrecy. It is also possible that the murderer's victim selection shifted under pressure. As the easiest victims were taken, the household might have reached for riskier ones, people slightly more known, slightly more visible, slightly more connected. This is how production-driven crime collapses. It exhausts the safest supply and begins to consume more dangerous material. The collapse was not immediate. It arrived through a specific victim whose presence in the house brought a different kind of witness attention and a different kind of evidence chain. Chapter 10, Mary Patterson. Beauty destroyed. Mary Patterson survives in public memory not because her death was uniquely brutal in method, but because the culture that retold the case found her useful. She becomes the pretty girl, the emblem of wasted youth, the victim whose attractiveness makes the crime feel more shocking. That framing is both revealing and distorting. It reveals what audiences choose to mourn. It distorts the truth that every victim was fully human regardless of whether a newspaper decided their face deserved to be remembered. To write about Mary Patterson honestly requires refusing the easy hook. Her beauty cannot be the story. The story is how a young woman, poor enough to be vulnerable, visible enough to be mythologized, could be drawn into a lodging house environment, rendered unconscious, killed without spectacle, and delivered into the anatomy trade as a commodity. The horror is not that she was beautiful. The horror is that she was purchasable. A young woman in a city that consumes the poor. Mary Patterson lived in a world where young women without secure family protection or stable employment moved through narrow choices. Domestic service, hawking, laundry work, casual labor, and sexual exchange were not always separate categories. Poverty blurs them. A woman might be a servant in one season and a street worker in another. She might keep house for a man for weeks and then sleep in lodging houses when that arrangement ended. She might sell sex, sell companionship, sell labor, sell whatever kept her indoors and fed. This is not moral judgment. It is the economic landscape. Young women in this environment learned quickly how to read risk. They learned which houses were safer, which men were trouble, which rooms offered warmth, which drinks were too strong, which friendships could be trusted. They were not naive. They were not children. They were, however, constrained by need. Need forces compromises. Compromises create openings. In the Westport, openings were fatal. How Mary becomes available. The murders depended on availability. A victim had to be isolated enough, or discounted enough, to be taken without creating immediate alarm. Mary Patterson fit a particular intersection, young, poor on the margins, moving in social circuits where her absence could be explained as drift. This is one reason she was vulnerable. Another is that she could be brought in plausibly. A young woman entering a lodging house for drink and company would not automatically attract suspicion. It was ordinary. It was daily life. It was the kind of movement the poor made constantly. The ability to treat this movement as ordinary is exactly what the murderers exploited. They did not need to drag Mary into a room. They needed to host her. Hospitality can be weaponized without changing its outward form. The social mechanics of the trap. A lodging house trap does not work through force alone. It works through social arrangement. Mary's entry into the household would have been framed as casual. A drink, a conversation, a bed, the usual progression of Westport evening life. The environment would have been noisy enough to mask sudden shifts. There would have been familiar rhythms, people coming and going, cups being poured, bodies sitting close, laughter, quarreling, the general blur of drink. For a young woman, the presence of another woman in the environment could matter. Female presence can lower a victim's sense of danger. A woman in a household, whether Helen McDougal, Margaret Hare, or another female figure, signals domestic normality. It suggests that the space is not entirely male and therefore not entirely predatory. This assumption is socially conditioned. It can be fatal. It is one reason women's proximity to the crimes has to be taken seriously. Female presence is not merely being there. It can be functional. Intoxication and control. Mary Patterson's death is often associated with heavy drinking. In the Westport murders, drink was not simply an accompaniment. It was a mechanism. It softened resistance, reduced noise, and allowed collapse to be treated as normal. A person who is heavily intoxicated becomes easier to isolate. She can be moved to a bed to sleep it off. She can be left in a room without other lodgers questioning why she is not leaving. Her silence can be interpreted as sleep. Her lack of response can be interpreted as ordinary drunkenness. This is what makes indoor murder so difficult to detect in poor neighborhoods. Drunkenness already looks like death in small ways: unconsciousness, shallow breathing, pallor, stillness. People are used to seeing bodies that appear close to lifeless and then revive later. That familiarity dulls alarm. When suffocation is applied to an intoxicated person, the shift from living to dead can be concealed inside a state that already resembles collapse. The killing as method. The murder of Mary Patterson, like the others, is generally understood as consistent with the method of restraint and suffocation. The method is significant because it does not produce the kind of injuries that would make a body obviously murdered to a casual observer. It is suited to producing a corpse that can be sold without attracting immediate questions. The killings were designed, in effect, to be medically acceptable specimens. They were murders calibrated for market. This calibration points back to the anatomy trade's role in shaping the violence. The goal was not only death. It was a saleable death. The body as product, freshness, and the market's appetite. Mary Patterson's body became notable in later accounts for one reason that reveals the buyer's priorities. She was reported to have been fresh enough to be displayed or admired in the anatomy setting before dissection. Whether every later embellishment is accurate is less important than the underlying fact it reflects, that freshness was valued, and that the human body was treated as an object whose aesthetic qualities could still be commented upon even after death. This is where the story becomes especially bleak. A young woman's body could be admired in one room and then cut apart in another. The admiration did not protect her. It was part of the consumption. The anatomy trade's hunger for fresh bodies turned victims into time-sensitive commodities. The faster the body reached the buyer, the higher the value. This pressured the killers to move quickly and repeatedly. It also pressured the domestic household to cooperate in rapid disposal, fewer days hiding bodies, fewer chances for discovery, more deliveries. The murder economy therefore demanded a household capable of immediate action after death. That capability depended on domestic organization. Helen's position during Mary's death. Mary Patterson's case is one of the places where Helen McDougal's proximity becomes especially important, because it reveals how a woman can be present in a household that kills a young woman and not become the central figure in later retellings. If Helen was in the house when Mary was brought in, she would have seen the social mechanics. If she was present after Mary's collapse, she would have understood that this was not an ordinary lodging house incident. If she benefited from the payment that followed, she would have been bound to the crime economically. A woman in Helen's position is not merely a witness. She is part of the household's continuity. Her presence can reassure a victim, normalize the environment for other lodgers, help manage the aftermath, maintain ordinary domestic routine while extraordinary acts occur. Again, none of this proves direct violence. It demonstrates functional entanglement. Entanglement is what makes the case psychologically and socially complex. It is easier to imagine male murderers acting alone than to imagine a household absorbing murder into its routine. Yet that is what repeated indoor crime requires. Margaret's position, the premises logic. If Mary's death occurred in premises linked to the Hares, Margaret's role becomes equally structural. A lodging house woman is not simply present. She is responsible for the flow of bodies in and out. She participates in the atmosphere that encourages drink. She is the face of domestic normality. She is also the manager of disruption. When a victim dies, the lodging house operator must restore the house. The operator must ensure that lodgers do not panic, that neighbors do not intrude, that the house remains commercially viable. This is not an incidental role. It is the reason the crimes could continue. Why Mary becomes myth. Mary Patterson's death becomes myth because it satisfies a cultural appetite for the tragic pretty victim. The myth does two things. It makes the case more emotionally engaging for readers who might otherwise overlook the poor. It reinforces the idea that some victims are more tragic than others. The result is morally distorted memory. Mary is mourned as exceptional because she is described as beautiful, while other victims are remembered only as nicknames or categories: old, daft, drunk, prostitute, pensioner. This hierarchy of mourning mirrors the hierarchy that made the murders possible in the first place. The poor were disposable, and even among the poor, some were treated as more worthy of attention than others. A woman-centered telling must resist this hierarchy. Mary's humanity matters not because she was beautiful, but because she was human and vulnerable in a system designed to exploit that vulnerability. A turning point in confidence. Mary Patterson's case also suggests increased confidence by the killers. A young woman could be brought in, killed, and sold successfully. The operation could handle a victim whose age and appearance might, in theory, trigger more concern. If the household could dispose of Mary without immediate consequence, it could convince itself that the method was nearly invulnerable. This is the psychological danger of successful crime. It teaches perpetrators that they are clever rather than lucky. It encourages them to take greater risks. It tempts them to believe that the environment will always protect them. The Westport murders did not end because the killers stopped wanting money. They ended because risk eventually outpaced concealment. What remains after Mary's death? Mary Patterson's death reveals the true shape of the Westport murders. Victims were not selected for personal reasons. Murder was calibrated to market needs. Domestic space was used as the killing ground. Women's domestic presence could be functional. The anatomy trade turned death into cash and made repetition profitable. Once this shape is recognized, the case can no longer be told as a story of two men committing isolated acts of evil. It becomes a story of a household economy and a city's professional demand converging on vulnerable bodies. Mary's death is not merely one tragedy among many. It is an illustration of how easily a young woman could be consumed by that convergence. Chapter 11, Daft Jamie. The murder that shocked Edinburgh. Some victims vanish without leaving a tear in the city's fabric. Their absence is absorbed into the ordinary churn of poverty. People move, people drink, people fall ill, people drift from lodging to lodging. In a place like the Westport, disappearance can be explained away by habit. James Wilson could not be explained away so easily. He was known, not as a man of standing,
but as a local presence, recognizable in the streets, familiar to the city, a figure people had seen often enough to develop a sense that he belonged somewhere. His nickname, Daft Jamie, is itself a record of how the period framed disability, affectionate to some, contemptuous to others, always reducing the individual to a trait. What made his death shocking was not only the violence. It was the breach of an unspoken rule that even criminals often observe instinctively: do not take those who are publicly visible. Visibility does not guarantee protection, but it increases risk. A person who is known creates questions. Questions pull at concealment. By killing James Wilson, the household moved beyond exploiting invisibility and began consuming recognizability. That shift reveals something about the killing season's late stage: growing confidence, growing appetite, and a willingness to accept greater danger for the sake of money. Who Jamie was, and why he mattered. Jamie's exact background survives only partially, filtered through later retellings and hostile descriptions. He is consistently presented as having an intellectual disability. He is also presented as physically distinctive enough to be remembered and identified. In a city where many poor men were anonymous, he became a character in the public imagination. This public character status is double-edged. It often means a person is noticed and spoken of. It does not mean the person is treated as fully human. People recognized Jamie, but they recognized him as entertainment, as nuisance, as local color. They might give him coins. They might mock him. They might greet him. Few would have imagined that this familiarity could become lethal. For the murderers, his recognizability created risk. For the city, it created a different kind of horror, the sense that if someone like Jamie could be taken, then the boundary of safety was not merely class, it was luck. The poor already knew they were vulnerable. Jamie's death showed that vulnerability could extend to the known and the familiar. Why they took him anyway. The question that follows Jamie's murder is simple: why did they do it? The most plausible answer is not complicated. The killing season was driven by profit. Profit requires supply. Supply is not infinite. As the murders continued, the easiest victims would have been exhausted, those most isolated, those least visible, those most transient. The household would then face a choice: stop or take riskier victims. Stopping would mean returning to ordinary labor and ordinary lodging house income, slower, harder, less immediately rewarding. A household accustomed to fast money often struggles to return to slow survival. The taste of profit changes what feels tolerable. Riskier victims therefore become more likely. Not because the perpetrators seek danger, but because they seek continuation. Jamie, in this context, becomes a convenient target in a brutal functional sense. He was vulnerable. He could be persuaded or led. He might accept drink or companionship. He could be controlled physically. He could be brought indoors without obvious resistance. The killer's calculation would have been that his vulnerability outweighed his visibility. They misjudged how much his disappearance would reverberate. The mechanics of taking a recognizable person. A recognizable victim does not have to be abducted to be taken. He only has to be moved from public space into private space under a plausible pretext. Lodging house operators and their associates were skilled at plausibility. They offered drink. They offered food. They offered warmth. They offered a bed. They offered companionship. A man like Jamie could be led by these offers because they were real needs. Vulnerable people are not naive for accepting what they require. They are constrained. Once indoors, the method could be applied as it had been applied to other victims: intoxication, restraint, suffocation, rapid disposal. The same procedural logic that worked on the anonymous could, in theory, work on the known, so long as the disposal was fast and the story plausible. The weakness in that logic is not method. It is aftermath. A recognizable person's absence generates search behavior. People mention it. They ask. They look. They form a narrative. Rumor intensifies. A lodging house can conceal a murder. It cannot easily conceal a city's collective noticing. Disability and disposability. Jamie's death also exposes a cruel contradiction in how the period treated disability. On one hand, disability made him visible. On the other, it made him disposable. A person with an intellectual disability was often treated as less credible, less autonomous, less defended. He could be mocked, exploited, or led. His protests, if he made them, might not be believed.
His confusion could be interpreted as ordinary daftness, rather than as fear. This made him a particularly vulnerable target, even though he was known. The combination of recognizability and disposability is what makes his murder so revealing. He was not protected by being known because what people knew about him was framed through contempt. Familiarity did not translate into guardianship. What this meant for the women. Jamie's murder forces the household's internal dynamics into sharper focus because the risk of detection rises. When risk rises, domestic management becomes more intense. A household operating a murder economy has to manage three things at once: the act itself, the disposal of the body, the social narrative afterward. Jamie's disappearance would have increased gossip. Neighbors might talk more openly. Lodgers might become more alert. Suspicion might attach to certain houses or certain men. The selective hearing and selective noticing of the Westport might begin to shift. In that environment, women's domestic roles become even more functional. Calming other lodgers, dismissing rumors, controlling access to rooms, maintaining ordinary routines to prevent a sense of abnormality, discouraging questions, reinforcing a consistent story. Again, this does not prove direct violence. It demonstrates how domestic labor becomes part of concealment under pressure. If Helen McDougal was present in the household during this escalation, she would have experienced heightened tension. If Margaret Hare was present in premises tied to the murder, she would have been exposed to increased gossip and risk. Either woman, in such circumstances, becomes more bound to silence because silence becomes the only method of household survival. The secret grows heavier. The household grows more volatile. The pressure to keep the operation running increases. The city's reaction: why this murder shocked. Edinburgh's shock was not purely moral. It was social. The poor were used to death. They were used to sudden illness and accident. They were used to violence. They were also used to the idea that their dead could be disturbed after burial. The city's professionals had normalized that risk. What shocked Edinburgh about Jamie was the sense of reach, that the killing was no longer limited to the most invisible and isolated. It had touched someone people expected to keep seeing. Shock also served another function. It made the case narratively compelling to the middle classes. A murdered character created a story hook. It made the violence feel closer. In this way, Jamie's murder becomes part of the case's cultural machinery. It helps the case travel beyond the Westport and into the broader city's imagination. That imagination would later demand a scapegoat and a spectacle. It would demand a body on a scaffold. Risk accumulates. Jamie's murder did not end the killing season. It did, however, increase the risk of exposure. Every time the killers chose a more recognizable victim, they tightened the net around themselves. They increased the number of people likely to speak, to search, to remember, and to connect absences. They also increased the chance that a victim would have been seen entering the lodging house by someone who could later testify. A murder economy can only sustain itself while its inputs remain quiet. Recognizable victims are noisy inputs. They carry social echoes. Jamie's murder therefore marks a late-stage escalation, the operation consuming risk along with bodies. It also foreshadows what would finally destroy the operation: a victim whose death created not only rumor but an evidence chain strong enough to reach court, supported by witnesses inside the lodging house environment itself. Toward the final victim. By the time the killing season reached its end, the murders were no longer merely a secret held by a household. They were becoming a rumor held by a neighborhood. Rumor is not proof, but it is pressure. Pressure changes behavior. Behavior creates mistakes. The final victim, Margaret Docherty, known also as Maggie, entered the story at the point when the household's confidence was high and its concealment was strained. She did not need to be the most visible victim to bring the system down. She only needed to be the victim whose death could not be disposed of cleanly and whose presence in the house could be established by witnesses. Chapter 12. The Final Victim. Maggie Docherty. The Westport murders ended not because the killers lost appetite for profit, nor because the city suddenly developed a conscience about the dead poor. They ended because a body became difficult to remove and because witnesses inside the lodging house world, people accustomed to looking away, looked directly, remembered clearly enough, and spoke. That final convergence of body, time, and testimony attached to a single woman, Margaret Docherty. She is often named in the record under shifting forms: Margaret, Marjorie, Mary, Docherty,
Docherty/Campbell, Maggie as familiar shorthand. The instability of her name reflects the instability of her life. Poor women moved through places where clerks wrote what they heard and remembered what was useful. They carried identities that were sometimes improvised and sometimes merely misunderstood. What remains constant is her position at the edge, a working-class woman, alone enough to be vulnerable, known enough to be described, and unlucky enough to become the hinge on which the case turned. Her death did not differ in method from others. What differed was circumstance. Maggie as a woman of movement. Docherty appears as a woman who traveled, who lodged where she could, who carried her possessions with her, and who relied on short-term arrangements. This was common among the poor. It was especially common among women without stable family support. A woman might move between towns, between work opportunities, between relationships, between kin who could briefly tolerate her presence. She might arrive in a city and seek immediate shelter. She might also arrive with a small amount of money, enough to make her attractive to predators who measured victims partly by what could be taken from them before the body was sold. Women like Docherty often traveled carrying a bundle. The bundle matters. It contains everything portable: clothing, small property, proof of identity if any existed, and the fragile sense that a person can still control her own life. In lodging house worlds, bundles are watched. They signal whether someone can pay, whether someone can be robbed, whether someone has connections. They are, bluntly, a form of inventory. Docherty's bundle would later become part of suspicion, because property has a way of outlasting the person who carried it. The meeting, the routine that precedes catastrophe. The final victim entered the case through what appeared, at first, to be ordinary lodging house social behavior. The street-level mechanics of the Westport murders were often mundane: conversation, drink, friendly attention, and the promise of lodging. People did not have to be forced. They had to be coaxed. Maggie met Burke and was drawn into his orbit through this familiar pattern. Whether through chance meeting or deliberate selection, she became the next guest brought indoors. The invitation would have carried the usual comforts: warmth, company, alcohol, a place to sleep. It would not have felt extraordinary. Lodging house life was built on casual intimacy. For a woman traveling alone, such casual intimacy could be both risk and necessity. Turning down companionship meant facing streets, cold, and uncertain shelter. Accepting it meant entering a private space controlled by strangers. Poverty often demands the second option. The household that received her did what it had likely done many times before. It turned hospitality into containment. Why this death became different. The crucial difference in Docherty's case was not the murder itself. It was the presence of other lodgers who became witnesses. The Westport murders had relied on controlled environments where outsiders could be kept ignorant or intimidated. Docherty's death occurred at a moment when the household's capacity to control observation failed. This failure can be understood through domestic strain. A killing household operating repeatedly in a crowded lodging environment is balancing multiple unstable elements. Keeping the victim quiet. Keeping other lodgers distracted. Managing time so the body can be removed quickly. Maintaining a plausible atmosphere. Preventing neighbors from becoming curious. Avoiding police attention. Controlling drink, noise, and movement. As murders repeat, the household often becomes more chaotic, not less. Alcohol consumption increases. Confidence turns into recklessness. The perpetrators begin to assume that the environment will always protect them. Docherty's case arrived at the point where the environment was no longer fully compliant. The lodgers, the people the story needed. The Westport murders were ultimately prosecuted through the testimony of people who lived close to the crime: lodgers, neighbors, acquaintances. These are not the witnesses the law prefers. They are poor, often intoxicated, sometimes inconsistent, and viewed with suspicion by authority. Yet they were also the only people positioned to see what happened indoors. In Docherty's case, two lodgers in particular become central: people sharing the space, noticing the presence of a stranger, noticing when that stranger stopped being seen, noticing the awkward domestic attempts to control access and movement afterward. Their significance lies in a simple fact: they did not vanish. They remained long enough to see patterns, and they were willing, eventually, to speak. This willingness was not guaranteed. It required a threshold of alarm higher than ordinary lodging house discomfort. It required something that made the situation feel not merely unpleasant but wrong. Docherty's death produced that threshold.
Helen's position in the hinge moment. This is where Helen McDougal becomes impossible to ignore. In the final victim narrative, Helen is not merely a background presence. She is a domestic gatekeeper. She is a woman in the house while another woman is brought in, entertained, and then disappears. She is positioned close enough to the event that later witnesses could place her in the sequence of movements and decisions. The household's ability to maintain control over Doherty depended on managing other lodgers' access. A woman in the house can do that in ways a man cannot without raising suspicion. A woman can claim domestic authority: who is allowed in, which room is private, what is being cleaned, who is sleeping, who should not be disturbed. Whether Helen used that authority deliberately for concealment or merely acted within domestic habit, the effect is similar. Domestic authority can become a barrier between witnesses and evidence. Doherty's case is therefore the point at which Helen's silence, or her participation, becomes most structurally significant. The last murder required domestic management under pressure. Domestic management is where women's roles reside. The problem of the body. In the earlier killings, bodies were removed quickly enough to prevent discovery. The anatomy trade rewarded speed, and speed reduced risk. In Doherty's case, the body became difficult to remove immediately. Reasons can vary: timing, the presence of lodgers, the need to wait for quiet, the risk of being observed leaving with a corpse. Whatever the precise cause, the result was the same: the body remained in the house long enough to create a problem. A body creates weight in a household. It changes smell. It changes movement. It demands concealment that is more active and more visible. It also creates time pressure. The longer a corpse remains, the greater the chance of discovery. This is the fragile point in any indoor murder operation. The act of killing can be quiet. The problem of the corpse is never quiet. When a body cannot be removed promptly, the domestic mechanics of concealment intensify. Rooms must be blocked. Access must be controlled. Lodgers must be managed or displaced. Stories must be repeated more forcefully. Domestic labor becomes conspicuous. Conspicuous domestic labor is itself suspicious. People notice when the house behaves differently. Doherty's body forced the house to behave differently. Property as evidence. The presence of Doherty's belongings added another point of strain. In many murder cases, property is what breaks secrecy because it cannot be disposed of as easily as a body. It has recognizable features. It can be traced. It can be seen in the wrong hands. A poor woman's bundle is also easier to notice because it is a visible unit. If she entered with it and it later appears without her, questions follow. This creates a secondary crisis for the murder household, not only how to dispose of the body, but how to dispose of the victim's identity. In working-class environments, identity is often tied to possessions. A woman without papers is still known by what she carries and wears. Those items become the residue of her existence. If lodgers saw Doherty arrive, they also saw her bundle. The bundle becomes part of their memory. When she vanishes, the memory remains. The collapse of routine. Doherty's death did not immediately trigger police intervention. It triggered the collapse of routine inside the lodging house. Routine collapses when other lodgers refuse to be displaced. Neighbors become curious. House operators cannot coordinate quietly. Stories contradict observable behavior. The household becomes visibly defensive. In a killing household, defensiveness is dangerous. It draws attention. It encourages people to interpret ordinary behavior as suspicious. The Westport murders had depended on ordinary behavior. The end came when behavior ceased to be ordinary. Doherty's presence, and then her sudden absence, forced behavior into abnormality. The house had to block rooms. It had to explain what did not make sense. It had to manage witnesses rather than simply ignore them. Once witnesses are being managed, the operation is already failing. A woman's disappearance becomes a case. The law does not usually pursue missing poor women aggressively. It lacks the incentive. It also lacks the framework. A poor woman can be assumed to have moved. Doherty's case became an exception because it created a chain of witness observation. The law can ignore a rumor. It struggles to ignore a specific anchored narrative. A woman enters a house, her belongings are seen, she is not seen leaving, the household behaves strangely afterward, another woman is blocked from rooms, a suspicious smell or disturbance is noticed, a body is found or strongly inferred. This chain transforms a disappearance into an accusation. It also transforms domestic space into evidence.
Doherty's death is therefore the moment the Westport murders stop being a neighborhood rumor and become a legal object.
Why this victim ends the season. The ending of the murder economy depended on 3 failures. The failure to remove the body swiftly. The failure to control witness perception inside the house. The failure to maintain domestic normality afterward. Doherty's case produced all 3. It also intersected with growing public anxiety. Rumors had already begun to circulate. Missing people had been noticed. The city was primed for explanation. The final victim did not create suspicion out of nothing. She provided a structure for suspicion to attach to. Once suspicion attaches to a specific household with witness support, the case becomes prosecutable. The state then has what it needs, not the entire truth of the killing season, but a legally manageable fragment of it. That fragment is enough to hang one man. And crucially, it is enough to bring Helen McDougal to the dock. Closing, the moment before exposure. By the time Doherty's death was complete, the household was no longer merely producing bodies. It was defending itself. Defense is labor. It is also visible. A killing household can function while its violence remains internal. It collapses when the violence begins to distort the household's outward behavior. Doherty's death distorted the household enough for outsiders to see through it. Chapter 13, Discovery and Arrest. The Westport murders did not end with a confession. They ended with interruption. Interruption is rarely dramatic. It begins with discomfort, with noticing, with small refusals to accept a story that does not match what the eyes have seen. In a lodging house environment, where people are trained to ignore noise and tolerate disorder, the threshold for interruption is high. When that threshold is crossed, it is usually because something has become too persistent to dismiss. Margaret Doherty's disappearance crossed that threshold. Her presence in the house had been witnessed. Her belongings had been seen. Her absence did not fit the usual pattern of lodging house drift. The household's behavior shifted into defensiveness. Rooms were controlled. Movement was restricted. Domestic routine became conspicuous. The murder economy had relied on the ordinary. Discovery begins when the ordinary becomes visibly forced. The last day as remembered by witnesses. The decisive evidence that brought the case into the open came from people who were not officials, lodgers, neighbors, and acquaintances. Their testimony is the reason the murders became a legal case rather than a rumor. In the days surrounding Doherty's death, the house contained multiple observers. They were not trained investigators. They were poor people alert to survival. Their attention is often dismissed in later retellings as accidental. It was not accidental. Lodgers observe because they must. They share space with strangers. They watch for theft. They watch for violence. They watch for sudden mood shifts in those who control the premises. A woman entering a lodging house stands out. The presence of another woman is noticed because women were fewer in many lodging arrangements and because women's movements were socially scrutinized. If Doherty arrived with a bundle, that too would be noticed. Bundles mean money, property, or at least the capacity to pay. Her disappearance was therefore not an absence from an anonymous void. It was an absence from a remembered scene. The household's attempt to regain control. After a killing, the household had one task: restore normality quickly enough that witnesses would stop thinking. Doherty's body remained in the house long enough to prevent that restoration. The household was forced into active concealment, which is more detectable than passive concealment. Active concealment produces behaviors that lodge in memory. Locked doors. Refusal of access. Unusual cleaning. Sudden instructions about where lodgers may go. Forced explanations delivered too quickly. Anger at questions that would normally be shrugged off. These behaviors are not proof in isolation. In combination, they become pattern. Pattern is what turns suspicion into action. Women's roles become particularly visible at this stage. A woman in the house can control domestic boundaries more naturally than a man can. She can claim the authority of household management, cleaning, rearranging, protecting privacy. That authority allows her to block access without immediately appearing criminal. Yet when blocking becomes persistent, it draws attention. Domestic authority can conceal, but it can also create focus. A locked room in a lodging house is unusual. It becomes a magnet for curiosity.
If Helen McDougal was involved in controlling access or explaining behaviour, she was participating in concealment regardless of whether she had participated in killing. This is one of the brutal truths of household crime, the distinction between after and during collapses. Once a person helps manage the aftermath, they become part of the crime's continuity.
The lodger's dilemma: speak or survive.
The witnesses who ultimately brought the case forward faced a dilemma that is rarely acknowledged in neat retellings.
Lodgers in a poor neighborhood do not report suspicion lightly. Speaking to authority can lead to retaliation from the household being accused, loss of lodging and immediate homelessness, police scrutiny of the witness's own behavior, disbelief, ridicule, or dismissal, social consequences in a community where dependence is mutual. The decision to act usually requires fear strong enough to override these costs. Doherty's disappearance created that fear because it felt immediate. It was not a rumor about unknown victims. It was a specific woman, seen in the house, and then erased. The lodger's proximity made the threat personal. If a woman could be killed in the next room, the house itself had become unsafe for everyone inside it. At that point, silence stops being protective. From suspicion to search. Once suspicion hardened, the key shift was from talk to physical search. In many domestic crime cases, discovery happens when outsiders insist on access to the concealed space. This insistence can come from neighbors, from a landlord, from a spouse, from a lodger. It is the moment when domestic authority loses its shield and becomes contested. A lodging house is vulnerable to search precisely because it is not fully private. It is semi-public.
Multiple people have claims to the space: those who pay to sleep there, those who manage it, neighbors who share walls, and often landlords who own the premises. If the house attempted to restrict access, that itself could provoke greater insistence. People in crowded poverty environments develop strong instincts about when something is being hidden, because hidden things often threaten collective safety. The search that followed was therefore not the work of refined detective method. It was the work of ordinary insistence, a refusal to accept explanation without looking. The body and the moment of irreversible exposure. The discovery of a body changes everything because it collapses ambiguity.
A missing woman can be dismissed as drift. A corpse cannot.
Once a corpse is found, the case is no longer social suspicion.
It becomes a legal fact.
Even then, the law's focus remains selective. The authorities do not necessarily attempt to prosecute all murders. They attempt to prosecute what can be proven. Doherty's body, connected to a precise time window and a specific household, provided what the law needed: a prosecutable anchor. The murders, in effect, condensed into one victim for the purpose of conviction. This condensation shaped everything that followed. It shaped who would be pursued, who would be protected, and who would become expendable to the state's need for a clean resolution.
Arrest as theater and containment.
Arrest in such a case is not only about taking suspects into custody. It is also about restoring public order. Once the Westport murders became public, fear and rage spread rapidly.
The poor feared they were prey.
The respectable feared that the city's institutions were tainted. The medical establishment feared scandal.
The authorities feared riot.
Arrest becomes a form of reassurance. It signals that the state has seized control of the narrative. Burke was arrested as the central male figure. Hare's position quickly became complex.
The state needed testimony. Hare could provide it.
That need would shape how he was treated. Helen McDougal was arrested because her presence in the house was undeniable. Her proximity to the final victim was established. In the public mind, her guilt was assumed. Arrest satisfied public demand even before trial could test evidence.
Margaret Hare's situation differed.
Her attachment to Hare and to the premises made her suspicious, but suspicion does not always translate into prosecution when the state has strategic priorities. Arrest therefore reveals not only who was likely culpable, but who the system decided it could afford to prosecute.
The first stories: how narrative hardens before trial.
Once arrests occur, the case begins to solidify in public imagination. This happens before evidence is formally tested. It happens through talk, press descriptions, street exaggeration, and the human need for moral clarity. In this phase, women are often turned quickly into symbols.
The depraved female accomplice. The witch-like partner who urged the men on.
The degraded drunk who must have known.
the abused woman who could not escape. These figures appear because the public dislikes ambiguity.
Helen McDougal and Margaret Hare both sit in the ambiguous zone, near violence, inside the domestic mechanism, but not easily pinned to a single act that satisfies narrative appetite.
The public fills that gap with archetype. This is not merely a cultural curiosity. It affects legal outcomes. Jurors are not immune to public atmosphere. Witnesses are not immune to pressure. Defendants are not immune to being stripped of complexity. By the time Helen faced trial, the public had already decided what she was. The court's task would be to decide what could be proven. Evidence begins to gather. After arrest, the case shifted from neighborhood observation to institutional processing. Statements were taken. Witnesses were organized. Timelines were assembled. Physical evidence, limited by the era's methods, was handled and interpreted. Yet the core of the case remained human testimony about domestic movement. Who entered the house? Who was seen drinking? Who slept where? Who was blocked from which rooms? What was heard through walls? What was seen carried out? What belongings remained? This is the kind of evidence domestic crime produces. It is not forensic. It is relational. It is vulnerable to attack, and yet it can be powerful when multiple witnesses align. In such evidence, women are often central because women are seen and remembered in domestic spaces. A man moving through a lodging house can blend into the general male traffic. A woman stands out. Her words are noted. Her movements are remarked upon. Her presence becomes a marker in witnesses' timelines. This visibility cuts both ways. It makes Helen more provable as present. It does not make her provable as killer. Presence becomes the battlefield. The state's priorities emerge. As the legal process began, a strategic priority quickly became clear: secure a conviction that would satisfy public demand and restore confidence. This required a principal offender, a coherent narrative, witness cooperation, manageable scope. Trying to prosecute the full series of murders would be difficult. Victims were numerous. Bodies were gone. Timelines were scattered. Witnesses were imperfect. The safest legal strategy was to anchor the case to one murder that could be proved strongly: Margaret Docherty's. This strategy created consequences. Burke became the center of legal blame. Hare became valuable as a witness. Helen became prosecutable as an adjacent figure. Margaret Hare remained less legally useful to pursue. The system did not necessarily reflect moral truth. It reflected prosecutorial feasibility. This is why the Westport murders produced outcomes that continue to disturb: one man executed, one man released, one woman acquitted but ruined, and another woman left in suspicion without full legal testing. The moment after arrest, the household dissolves. Arrest dissolves the domestic system that sustained the murders. The lodging house, once an engine, becomes a site of scrutiny. The rooms that held secrecy become rooms examined and discussed. The domestic routines that concealed violence become evidence of concealment. For Helen McDougal, this dissolution is particularly significant. Her identity had been fused with a household and a man. Once the household collapses, she becomes exposed as an individual in a way the domestic economy had not required before. She must stand alone before the law, judged not only on actions but on association. Association is often enough to destroy a woman socially, even when it is not enough to convict her legally. Closing, the line between rumor and court. Discovery and arrest mark the point where the Westport murders leave the domain of rumor and enter the domain of court. This shift does not guarantee truth. Courts produce verdicts, not complete histories. They select evidence. They narrow narratives. They privilege what can be said clearly. For Helen McDougal, this narrowing would be decisive. Her life would be condensed into witness descriptions and prosecutorial strategy. Her complexity would be flattened into legal categories. Chapter 14, Helen on Trial. When Helen McDougal entered the High Court of Justiciary, she entered a space built to do one thing: turn messy human reality into a verdict. Courts do not explain lives. They compress them. They select the pieces that can be turned into facts, and discard the rest as noise. For working-class women, the compression is harsher. Their ordinary lives leave fewer records. Their reputations, however, leave plenty. McDougal's trial was therefore never only about what she did.
It was about what could be proven, what could be inferred, what could be made plausible to a jury under public pressure, and what kind of woman she appeared to be in a room that assumed it already knew what women like her were.
The city wanted certainty. The law offered a narrower product, proof. The legal frame, one murder, not many.
By the time McDougal stood trial, the Westport murders were already a larger story than any court could comfortably prosecute in full.
Too many victims, too few bodies, too much reliance on rumor.
The state's strategy was to anchor the case to what was most provable, the death of Margaret Docherty.
This legal narrowing shapes the entire trial.
It means that the courtroom did not, and could not, try McDougal for being involved in the Westport murders in the broad cultural sense.
It tried her for a specific charge connected to a specific victim.
The prosecution's task was not to prove that she was morally tainted by association.
It was to prove legal culpability in a particular death.
This is a high bar, especially for a woman whose suspected participation, if it existed, was likely domestic, indirect, and embedded in household routine rather than in a single observable act.
The narrowing also serves the state's need for resolution. A conviction in one clear murder could stand in for a season of deaths.
Burke could be executed on one charge and symbolically made responsible for all.
The city could accept the ending.
McDougal's presence in court complicated that symbolic ending.
A woman on trial beside Burke forced the story to widen again. The atmosphere, fear, anger, and an appetite for blame.
No defendant enters court in a vacuum, but McDougal entered under an especially volatile atmosphere.
The public fear generated by the murders was not only fear of crime.
It was fear of institutions, fear that respectable medical men had benefited, fear that bodies were being traded openly, fear that the poor were not safe even after death.
That fear demanded an outlet. Burke could serve as the primary outlet.
Hare, protected by the state's need for testimony, could not be punished in the same way.
That imbalance created further rage.
If Hare was to escape, then other figures would carry the anger that could not be placed on him.
McDougal, by her presence, became one such figure.
Women in violent cases often attract a particular kind of fury, less about what they did than about what they represent. Betrayal of the expected female role of care, the fear that domestic spaces are not safe, the anxiety that women can be complicit rather than merely victims.
This fury expresses itself through moral language. Depraved, unnatural monster, she must have known. It is a fury that does not require evidence. It requires only proximity. The court could not officially convict on fury. It could, however, be influenced by the atmosphere fury creates. The problem of evidence, presence is not action.
The central difficulty in prosecuting McDougal was that presence is not the same as action.
Witnesses could place her in rooms, in houses, in conversations. They could recall her drinking. They could recall her manner. They could describe her controlling access, speaking sharply, behaving defensively. These details create a portrait of suspicion. They do not necessarily create proof of murder.
To convict McDougal for Docherty's death, the prosecution would need to show more than that she was in the household. It would need to show that she knowingly participated in the killing or in the concealment in a way that satisfied legal standards for guilt.
This is where domestic crime becomes difficult for law. Domestic participation often looks like blocking access to rooms, telling a lodger to go elsewhere, managing a story, cleaning a space, handling clothing and bedding, repeating routines that normalize what should be alarming. These acts can be criminal in effect and still be ambiguous in isolation.
A woman can claim she was cleaning, managing house rules, or responding to a quarrel.
A woman can claim she did not know what happened behind a door. Courts demand more than suspicion.
The prosecution's task, therefore, was to convert domestic ambiguity into legal certainty.
Character as weapon, how reputation enters trial.
In cases like this, character evidence and reputation become powerful because they fill gaps that factual evidence cannot.
For a working-class woman, reputation can be fatal.
It is shaped by class contempt, gender judgment, and the tendency to interpret female assertiveness as deviance.
Witness descriptions of McDougal often emphasized her drinking, her quarrelsomeness, her coarse speech, her physicality, her volatility.
These traits, whether accurate in degree or distorted by prejudice, would make her easier to imagine as capable of wrongdoing. Jurors and observers could look at a woman described as loud and drunken and conclude she was morally capable of anything.
This is not the same as proof. It is persuasion.
The trial's emotional force would have been shaped not only by what witnesses said happened, but by what the court believed a woman like McDougal was. This is the mechanism by which women are often condemned socially even when the law cannot convict them. Their reputations make them believable as villains.
Helen in the household, what could be proved?
The witnesses who mattered most were those who could establish a tight chain around the final victim.
That Doherty entered the premises.
That she was seen in company with Burke and within the household environment.
That she was not seen leaving. That the household behaved unusually afterward. That access was controlled. That McDougal's movements and behaviour intersected with these facts.
If McDougal was seen preventing lodgers from entering rooms, or if she was seen acting in ways that suggested concealment rather than ordinary management, that would weigh heavily in court.
Yet even here, ambiguity remains. Lodging house women often did control access. They often were sharp with lodgers. They often cleaned. They often defended private space. These behaviors can be normal. The question becomes, were they normal in this context?
This is where the narrative weight of the broader murders pressed on the courtroom. Even if the trial was technically about one death, everyone in the room knew, or believed, that many people had been killed.
That knowledge colors interpretation.
An act that might be dismissed as ordinary in a different case becomes suspicious here. This is how large crimes distort judgment. They convert ordinary behavior into sinister evidence. The state's balancing act, convicting Burke without losing control. The prosecution's central objective was securing Burke's conviction.
Everything else was secondary.
McDougal's presence alongside Burke created a risk. If the prosecution pushed too hard against her without strong evidence, it could muddy the case, create confusion, and open avenues for defense arguments about unreliable witnesses or overreach. Courts under public pressure often become careful in an unexpected way. They aim for the cleanest conviction possible.
Burke could be convicted if the case stayed tight.
McDougal could be pursued, but pursuing her too aggressively could complicate the prosecution's clarity. This strategic tension likely shaped how the evidence against her was handled. The court could allow suspicion to be voiced without relying on it for conviction. It could pursue her enough to satisfy public demand that the woman be tried, while still allowing the evidence to fall short. This is one plausible pathway to the verdict that followed, not proven. The defense posture, creating doubt inside a hungry room. A silent narrator cannot invent defense arguments as though they were spoken word for word. The record, when it exists, often compresses courtroom speech. What can be described is the structural defense posture available to McDougal. Emphasize absence of direct evidence of her killing act. Emphasize the prosecution's burden. Suspicion is not proof. Suggest that household behavior could be explained by fear, drink, or confusion. Undermine witness credibility where possible. Lodgers, drink, class prejudice. Frame McDougal as a woman in a man's household, not the household's controller. Point to the complexity of domestic movement. Being present does not equal knowing. The defense did not need to prove McDougal innocent in a moral sense. It needed only to persuade the jury that certainty was unattainable. In Scottish law, the presence of a third verdict, not proven, creates space for this outcome. It allows jurors to act on suspicion emotionally while withholding legal condemnation. It is a verdict shaped for cases that feel guilty but cannot be proven.
McDougal's case fit that shape.
Gendered assumptions, the court's unspoken questions. Even when not articulated, certain assumptions hover over women in domestic crime cases.
The court is not only asking, did she do it? It is also asking, what kind of woman is she? Is she the kind of woman who would help? Is she a victim of the man, or his equal partner? If she was present, why didn't she stop it? These questions are morally loaded.
They rely on the fantasy that women always have the power to intervene, the duty to intervene, and the safety to intervene. They punish women for surviving inside dangerous domestic spaces. At the same time, those questions can also cut the other way. They can allow jurors to imagine a woman as too weak, too dependent, too frightened to be legally responsible, even when her domestic labor has functioned as concealment. The same gendered assumptions that condemn women socially can protect them legally.
The protection is not respect. It is condescension.
McDougal's position would have been shaped by both. Condemned as morally deviant, excused as legally secondary. The verdict's shadow already forming. Even before verdict, the trial placed McDougal in a trap created by the law's limits. If she were convicted, she would be punished as an accomplice to murder. If she were acquitted, she would be punished socially as a woman who got away. Either way, she would not return to ordinary life. The trial itself ensured that. Her name, her face, her association would be permanent. This is one reason her later disappearance from the record is not mysterious in the romantic sense. It is structurally predictable. A woman publicly associated with the Westport murders could not remain safely in Edinburgh. Even innocence would not have protected her. Ambiguity protected her least of all. Closing, a court can only do what it can do. The trial of Helen McDougal did not ask the question modern readers most want answered: what precisely did she do behind closed doors? The court asked what it could test with available evidence and legal standards. It asked whether her involvement in Docherty's death could be proven beyond the threshold required to condemn. The answer the court would deliver was not a clear exoneration and not a clear condemnation. It was a verdict that institutionalized ambiguity. Chapter 15, The Verdict. Not proven. A courtroom verdict can sound definitive and still leave a person ruined. In Scotland, the phrase "not proven" has always carried a strange weight. It is an acquittal in law, but not in feeling. It says, "We do not have enough to convict you, yet we cannot bring ourselves to say you are innocent." It is the state's method of releasing a person while preserving suspicion. For Helen McDougal, this verdict was not an ending. It was a transformation. From defendant to living remainder, the person left over once the law has taken what it needs from a story and refuses to take responsibility for what remains. Why the jury could not convict. To convict McDougal, the jury would have needed evidence that tied her to the act of murder, participation that could be described as more than presence, more than association, more than domestic behaviour that might be explained away. The available evidence likely did not reach that threshold. The strongest proofs in the case pointed toward Burke as the actor whose violence could be anchored to the final victim. McDougal's actions, by contrast, sat in the domestic margins, the realm of doors, rooms, drink, explanations, and routine. Domestic crime produces domestic evidence, ambiguous, relational, difficult to render into certainty. And in a case already swollen with public fear and rumor, the court was under pressure to deliver at least one unequivocal outcome. That outcome was Burke. Where evidence could not provide the clarity required for conviction, the jury could still express its suspicion through not proven. This was a way of satisfying both law and appetite, the law's demand for proof, and the public's demand that the woman not be cleared too cleanly. It is important to understand what this means. Not proven is not mercy. It is a decision about evidence. It also functions as a social signal: she is free, but you may continue to treat her as guilty. Why the jury could not say not guilty. If not proven exists, it exists because juries sometimes find themselves caught between two forms of discomfort. To convict without proof feels like injustice. To acquit cleanly feels like complicity with evil. In sensational cases, this discomfort intensifies. The jury is not only deciding a charge, it is deciding how the community will feel about the outcome. A clean acquittal of McDougal would have forced Edinburgh to confront an uncomfortable truth, that a woman could be deeply implicated in a killing household and still not be legally condemnable. It would have forced the city to accept that the law cannot always deliver moral satisfaction. Not proven allows the city to avoid that acceptance. It releases her while ensuring she remains stained. The verdict therefore served a broader function than justice. It served narrative management. The meaning of release for a woman like Helen. For men, acquittal can sometimes restore a path, especially if the man has trade, contacts, or the capacity to leave and start again under a changed name. For working-class women, especially those publicly associated with murder, release is often a kind of exposure. McDougal's security had been tied to a household. That household now collapsed. Burke, the man whose presence had provided shelter and danger in equal measure, was condemned. Hare, the man whose testimony would secure the state's case, was protected. McDougal stood alone. Alone in such a context is not freedom. It is vulnerability. A woman with no stable family network, no protected trade, and a public reputation saturated with scandal becomes a target. She becomes a vessel for displaced rage. She becomes a figure people feel entitled to punish because the law did not.
The verdict therefore created a gap. The court could not punish her. The public believed she deserved punishment. This is the gap in which mob justice thrives. Public response: the city's punishment begins. Edinburgh did not treat the verdict as closure. It treated it as failure. It treated it as insult. People wanted the case to resolve cleanly: monsters punished, safety restored, moral order reasserted. McDougal disrupted that reassertion simply by remaining alive. After a verdict like not proven, the defendant's safety depends on the community's willingness to accept legal boundaries. In a case that had already inflamed fear and outrage, that willingness was minimal. The verdict allowed the crowd to believe. The law admits suspicion. Therefore the crowd is justified in acting on that suspicion. This is how a legal acquittal becomes a social sentence. McDougal's name had already been dragged through the public imagination. She was described not merely as an accused person but as a type: violent, drunken, depraved, unnatural. Once typed, she could be attacked without the attacker feeling guilt. The attacker could tell himself he was defending the community. Women in this position are often pursued not only because they are believed guilty, but because they are reachable. Hare could be guarded and protected by the state. Burke could be contained by prison walls until execution. McDougal, released, could be found in streets and lodging houses. The city's rage needed an outlet. She became one. The gendered double-bind: too guilty to live, too female to convict. The not proven verdict exposes a gendered contradiction that runs through much 19th century criminal storytelling. Women near violent crime are often treated as morally contaminating. They are accused of urging men on, of corrupting them, of being worse, because they violate feminine expectations. Yet when it comes to legal responsibility, those same women can be framed as secondary, dependent, or coerced, too close to the domestic sphere to be imagined as principal actors. This contradiction produces the perfect target: socially condemned, legally ambiguous, publicly available for punishment. The verdict does not resolve this contradiction. It intensifies it. McDougal became a figure who could not be proved guilty but could be treated as guilty without restraint. What the verdict did to the story. Once Burke was convicted, the public story began to center on his execution. The city needed an ending. The law provided it through the scaffold. Yet the story still contained loose threads: the anatomy trade's complicity, the medical establishment's benefit, Hare's escape, Margaret Hare's shadowy role, and McDougal's unresolved guilt. Not proven functioned as a narrative plug. It allowed the official story to move forward without resolving the discomfort fully. It kept suspicion alive while freeing the legal system from the burden of proving what it could not prove. This is why the verdict remains so haunting. It is the institutionalization of uncertainty. It is also why later retellings have been so eager to decide McDougal's guilt definitively. The verdict left a vacuum. Folklore and outrage rushed to fill vacuums. The practical aftermath: flight as the only survival strategy. A woman in McDougal's position could not remain easily in Edinburgh. Even if she had wanted to, the risk was immediate. Once a crowd has decided a person deserves punishment, the person's body becomes unsafe in public space. Flight becomes the only strategy that offers any chance of survival. Yet flight for a poor woman is dangerous. It requires money. It requires places to sleep. It requires moving through districts where a stranger can be exploited, robbed, or assaulted. It requires new lies about identity. It requires constant vigilance. It also requires accepting that ordinary life has ended. This is why McDougal's later fate becomes murky. Not because her story is inherently mysterious, but because the conditions after the verdict encourage disappearance. A woman escaping public rage does not leave letters. She does not register with authorities. She does not announce her destination. She moves quietly or she dies. The record's silence is therefore not romantic. It is the sound of survival under threat. The verdict's moral residue. The not proven verdict left several moral residues in the city. It allowed Edinburgh to keep believing in its own respectability. The city could punish Burke and treat the case as a deviation rather than a symptom. It left the anatomy trade largely intact. The market that rewarded bodies did not disappear overnight simply because one supplier was caught. It left the poor with reinforced fear. The poor already feared that their bodies were vulnerable. The case confirmed it. The The verdict confirmed that even justice was uneven. It left women as symbolic battlegrounds. McDougal's verdict demonstrated that a woman could be prosecuted, stained, and abandoned by the system whether or not she could be convicted. These residues help explain why the Westport murders did not fade quickly from cultural memory. They touched too many sensitive points: class vulnerability, institutional hypocrisy, and the fragile boundary between domestic life and violence. Closing, the verdict as beginning. The verdict released McDougal, but it did not restore her. It declared her legally uncondemned and socially unprotected. It placed her outside the law's punishment and inside the crowd's reach. From this point forward, her story is no longer primarily legal. It is physical: how to remain alive when a city wants you hurt. Burke's story will proceed toward the scaffold, where the law can perform its ending. McDougal's story proceeds into a different kind of darkness, the afterlife of accusation. Chapter 16, After the Gallows. Burke's execution offered Edinburgh the kind of closure that crowds crave: a body displayed as proof that the state can still punish, a public ritual that transforms fear into spectacle, and an ending clean enough to tell oneself that the danger has passed. Yet executions do not resolve the conditions that produce crime. They resolve only the person chosen to carry the weight of it. After the gallows, the Westport murders remained alive in the city, not as an active killing operation, but as residue, in fear, in gossip, in moral outrage, and in the uncomfortable knowledge that the anatomy trade had consumed murder's product. The hanging did not simply end a story. It rearranged its blame. For Burke, the state offered a final role: condemned murderer, executed, then, most symbolically, dissected. For everyone else involved, the aftermath was messier. It was not controlled by a scaffold. It was controlled by survival. The execution as civic theatre. Public executions in this period were not private punishments. They were civic events. They served multiple functions at once. They demonstrated state authority. They offered a community ritual of revenge. They warned others. They provided entertainment disguised as morality. They allowed the public to participate in justice without confronting complexity. The Westport murders had inflamed Edinburgh's anxiety to an unusual degree. The poor feared that they could be taken. The respectable feared that the city's institutions were tainted. The medical establishment feared scandal. The authorities feared unrest. Execution became a pressure valve. Crowds gathered not simply to see a man die, but to see a narrative resolve. Burke's death was meant to reassure: the murderer is removed, order is restored, the city can breathe again. But the crowd's appetite was larger than reassurance. It wanted symbolic reversal. Dissection as symbolic reversal. The decision to dissect Burke after execution carried a particular moral force because of the case's connection to anatomy. His crimes had turned bodies into medical material. Now his own body would be turned into medical material. This reversal was satisfying to the public for reasons deeper than punishment. It translated the city's fear into a simple logic: the man who sold bodies will become a body. The anatomy trade that benefited from murder will now consume the murderer himself. It also allowed the medical establishment to reassert legitimacy. If Burke's body was dissected publicly or with public knowledge, it signaled that medicine was now aligned with justice rather than complicit in crime. Yet the symbolic reversal did not erase the reality that the trade itself had functioned only because buyers were willing to accept bodies without asking hard questions. The public could focus on Burke's dissection and avoid confronting the system. The city preferred a body to blame over an institution to reform. Hare, the man who escaped by speaking. If Burke's fate offered closure, Hare's fate offered insult. The state's reliance on Hare's testimony, its willingness to treat him as a tool, created a social imbalance. The public wanted both men punished. The law wanted one conviction it could secure. The law chose the conviction and used Hare to obtain it. This is not a special kind of corruption. It is a normal prosecutorial strategy. It is also a strategy that becomes poisonous when the crime is so widely feared that the public cannot tolerate pragmatic compromise. Hare's escape from full punishment did not feel like justice. It felt like betrayal. That feeling spilled outward. The crowd looked for targets. Hare was protected by the structure of his deal. Burke was already condemned. The remaining reachable figures were the women. Margaret Hare, suspicion without resolution. Margaret Hare emerges from the legal narrative as a shadow of guilt,
present, suspected, but not given the kind of formal judgment that would settle her role in the public mind. This is not because suspicion against her was absent. It is because the system did not need to prosecute her to achieve its primary goal. Margaret's household had been an engine of the murders. Her domestic role likely involved facilitation, managing lodgers, normalizing drink, controlling domestic boundaries, participating in concealment. Yet these forms of involvement are harder to prosecute than the killing act itself, especially when the prosecution's strongest witness is her husband. Pursuing Margaret aggressively could have destabilized Hare's cooperation. It could have complicated the narrative. It could have produced an additional trial without a guaranteed conviction. The state does not always pursue every morally culpable actor. It pursues the resolution it can secure. Margaret therefore remained suspended, socially condemned, legally untested. Her fate in public memory becomes, like Helen's, a field of rumor. Some accounts suggest she vanished into another town. Some suggest she was attacked. What is consistent is the pattern: women attached to scandal do not remain safely visible. They disappear because visibility becomes dangerous. Helen McDougal, acquitted and hunted. For Helen McDougal, the aftermath was immediate and physical. A not proven verdict released her from legal custody but did not release her from public judgment. In fact, it sharpened public rage. The crowd could interpret the verdict as permission. Even the court suspects her. If the court will not punish her, the crowd will. This is how law and mob violence can form a grim partnership. The court withholds conviction but leaves moral stain. The crowd treats stain as proof. In the period after the verdict, Helen's safety in Edinburgh would have been fragile. People recognized her. Word traveled quickly in poor neighborhoods. A face associated with scandal becomes a target not only for moral outrage but for opportunistic violence, assault justified as righteousness. Flight becomes the only plausible strategy. Yet flight for a poor woman is not a clean narrative of escape. It is a series of precarious movements, moving between lodging houses, avoiding recognition, relying on strangers, guarding against exploitation. A man can leave town and find labor. A woman leaving town risks hunger, rape, arrest, and confinement. Helen's disappearance from the record is therefore not surprising. It is expected. The woman who survives scandal survives by becoming untraceable. The state could not convict her. The public could still destroy her. The West Port, a neighborhood under suspicion. After the gallows, the West Port did not become safer overnight. It became watched. Suspicion attaches to places as well as people. The West Port already carried a reputation for disorder. The murders intensified that reputation into something closer to stigma. Lodging houses became frightening. Neighbors became potential witnesses. Poor people became potential victims. In such a climate, ordinary West Port residents suffered additional consequences. Landlords increased control. Police attention intensified. Outsiders avoided the area. Local economies tied to lodging and drink were disrupted. The poor were treated as both vulnerable and suspicious. Crime narratives often focus on perpetrators and victims. The aftermath reveals the community cost, a neighborhood already strained by poverty, now burdened by fear and surveillance. The West Port became a symbol of underworld danger, and symbols are rarely fair to the people living inside them. The anatomy trade, the scandal that could not fully land. The case threatened the medical establishment's reputation, but it did not dismantle the anatomy trade's underlying logic. Bodies were still needed. Training still required cadavers. The shortage of lawful supply still existed. The scandal forced the city to look at what it had tolerated. It produced outrage, yes, but outrage is not reform. Reform requires structural changes in how bodies are obtained and how medical teaching is conducted. The West Port murders therefore become one of those cases that exposes systemic hypocrisy without immediately resolving it. Burke's dissection provided symbolic satisfaction, but symbolism is cheaper than transformation. The market that had rewarded death did not vanish because the most visible suppliers were caught. What closure actually meant. Edinburgh's closure was selective. It meant Burke dead and dissected. The court's authority reasserted. The crowd's desire for spectacle satisfied. The story narrowed to a few named villains. The broader complicity left unpunished. This is how societies cope with crimes that implicate them. They locate evil in individuals rather than in the structures that made the crime profitable. The danger of this coping mechanism is that it leaves the underlying conditions intact. A city that needed bodies and tolerated a black market will continue to need bodies. A poor population treated as disposable will continue to be disposable. A lodging house economy built on transience will continue to absorb the vulnerable. The case becomes legend. The conditions remain. The women as the unresolved remainder. After the gallows, the most unresolved figures in the story were not the executed man and not the escaped informer. They were the women, Helen and Margaret, because they disrupt the simplicity of the narrative. If women were merely passive victims, the story stays comfortably male. Men did evil, the state punished them. If women were active accomplices, the story becomes more disturbing, domestic space itself becomes implicated, and the crime becomes a household economy rather than a male conspiracy. The historical record does not allow a clean verdict on either woman's precise acts. It does allow an understanding of their structural involvement. They occupied positions that made the murders easier to commit and harder to detect. Domestic authority, control of access and story, participation in the household economy, proximity to victims, social credibility that reduced suspicion. Their fates after the case, flight, disappearance, rumor, are consistent with how scandal consumes women. Women become the carrier of moral contamination long after the principal male actor is dead. This is why the title The Silent Partner resonates beyond Helen alone. Silence in this story is not merely the absence of speech. It is enforced by survival, demanded by household entanglement, and later imposed by public punishment. Closing, the story that would not stay buried. Burke's body was taken, dissected, reduced to specimen. The city could tell itself that justice had been performed. But the Westport murders refused burial. They remained as an urban myth with teeth, warnings told to children, jokes told in taverns, sermons delivered from pulpits, whispered fears about lodging houses and anatomy rooms. The case lived because it touched something raw, the fear that the poor are not protected, and that the respectable can profit from their vulnerability. Epilogue, the legacy of silence. Edinburgh wanted the Westport murders to end the way respectable stories end, a villain identified, a punishment delivered, a lesson absorbed. Burke on the scaffold gave the city its clean ending. Burke on the dissection table gave it a symbolic reversal that felt almost like moral symmetry. The poor could tell themselves the danger had been named. The respectable could tell themselves the city's institutions had been purified by the public theatre of justice. Yet the case did not resolve cleanly, because it never belonged only to Burke and Hare. It belonged to Edinburgh's appetite for bodies, to its tolerance of a market that fed that appetite, and to the daily invisibility of the poor that made the victims easy to take and slow to miss. It belonged to lodging houses and narrow closes, to the rhythms of drink and debt, to the way domestic life can be weaponized when survival is precarious and moral boundaries are already thin. The case also belonged to the women, Helen McDougal and Margaret Hare, because women in this story function as the remainder the city could not comfortably process. Their roles were too domestic to prosecute cleanly and too proximate to ignore. Their fates were too uncertain to satisfy a public hungry for moral certainty. Silence, in the end, became their most consistent record. What the court concluded, and what the city believed. The High Court did what courts do, it narrowed. It anchored the vastness of the killing season to a single provable murder. It selected what could be spoken as evidence. It did not attempt to explain every disappearance and could not have, even if it had wanted to. The law produced a verdict, not a full history. The public, however, did not live by the law's limits. It lived by fear, outrage, and narrative instinct. It wanted the case to mean something decisive about the city's safety and the world's order. It wanted villains who could be punished in proportion to the terror inflicted. Burke's execution allowed the public to pretend proportionality existed. Hare's release destroyed that pretense. Helen's not proven verdict turned ambiguity into provocation. Margaret's untested culpability left suspicion hanging like smoke that would not clear. The law's resolution felt incomplete because it was incomplete. This is the first legacy, a case solved in court but unsettled in the street. The anatomy trade after the scandal. The Westport murders are often spoken of as though they forced medicine to change overnight. In reality, the deeper change required something more than scandal. It required a replacement for the black market. The case made the anatomy trade's dependence on illicit supply impossible to deny publicly. It demonstrated in the most brutal way what can happen when demand for cadavers is high, lawful supply is low, and buyers are willing to accept bodies without demanding origins.
Burke and Hare did not invent that structure. They exploited it. The scandal did not erase the need. Students still needed cadavers. Teachers still needed specimens. Medical ambition did not dissolve because murder had briefly fed it. So the question the city faced was not whether anatomy should exist, but how to make anatomy compatible with law and moral order. The murders became an argument, used in different ways by different factions, for formal regulation and a more reliable lawful supply. This is the second legacy. The Westport murders forced Edinburgh to look at what it had tolerated, even if the city preferred not to look for long. The poor dead and the unequal cost of progress. The most enduring wound of the case is not only that people were killed. It is that they were killed because the city had already created a hierarchy of bodies. Edinburgh treated some bodies as naturally defended, those buried with family protection and social standing. It treated other bodies as naturally available, those who died poor, alone, or publicly discounted. That hierarchy existed before the murders. The murders revealed it with grotesque clarity. They showed what happens when disposability is taken seriously as an economic principle. The victims were not targeted for personal reasons. They were targeted because their lives were easy to interrupt and their deaths could be explained away. This is why the case cannot be reduced to the depravity of two men. It is a case about the fragility of protection when poverty already renders people socially light. This is the third legacy. The murders are a moral indictment of a society that made certain lives easy to erase. The Westport as symbol and scapegoat. After the trials, the Westport became more than a place. It became shorthand. It was used as a warning: what happens in the underbelly, what the poor do when left to rot, what kind of spaces produce violence. This symbolic use had consequences for the people who lived there. Poor neighborhoods often become scapegoats for crimes that arise from broader structures. The city could locate danger over there in the Westport and avoid confronting how the anatomy trade's demand came from respected institutions over here. It could treat lodging houses as dens of evil and avoid examining why lodging houses were necessary for migrant laborers and the displaced poor. By turning the Westport into a symbol, Edinburgh cleansed itself imaginatively. The underbelly could be blamed as though it were separate from the body above it. This is the fourth legacy. The city externalized guilt into geography. Helen McDougal, The Silence of Survival. Helen McDougal's legacy is not a clear answer about guilt. It is a lesson about what happens to women who survive proximity to monstrous crime. Her name persists because it was spoken in court, printed in accounts, and repeated in retellings that wanted a female shadow in the story. Yet her life, as a life, dissolves. She does not receive the biographical attention granted to men. She is not traced carefully after the verdict. She becomes folklore, attacked, fled, vanished, died in some distant place, versions multiplied because the record stops and imagination rushes in. The reasons for that stopping are structural. A working-class woman who becomes publicly notorious does not have many safe options. She cannot easily remain where she is recognized. She cannot easily rebuild under her own name. She must become quiet or be destroyed. The silence attached to Helen is therefore not merely narrative. It is literal, the silence of a woman forced out of public life by accusation and rage, regardless of what she could or could not be proved to have done. Her role, whatever its exact contours, also exposes how domestic labor can be implicated in crime. Crime conducted indoors requires domestic management. Domestic management is historically feminized labor. This means women's involvement can be both central and difficult to prosecute, because the acts that sustain the crime resemble ordinary household work. Helen's story sits in that uncomfortable truth. She is not easily categorized as innocent witness or active killer. The world she inhabited does not produce clean categories. Margaret Hare, The Silence of Premises. Margaret Hare's silence is different. It is not only the silence of flight. It is the silence created by strategic prosecutorial choices and by the gendered invisibility of domestic authority. Margaret's premises, her lodging house world, was a mechanism that enabled victims to be brought inside and made to disappear. A woman attached to premises can exert power that is not always seen as power: control of beds, drink, and access to space.
That power can facilitate crime without producing obvious criminal acts in the way the law recognizes them. Margaret also sits in the shadow of Hare's deal. When the state chooses one man as witness, it often chooses not to destabilize him by prosecuting his household further. The result is a familiar pattern: the man is used, the woman is left in suspicion, and the record becomes thin because the law no longer needs her story. She too becomes folklore. She too becomes a rumored ending. This is the fifth legacy. Women's culpability or innocence is often left unresolved because the system prioritizes conviction over comprehension. Why the case persists. The Westport murders persist in memory because they contain multiple terrors at once. The terror of being taken indoors, quietly, without spectacle. The terror that death can be commodified. The terror that respectable institutions can benefit while denying responsibility. The terror that the poor are not defended even in death. The terror that domestic space, supposed to be shelter, can become a killing room. And beneath these, another discomfort, that the story cannot end cleanly because not everyone was punished, not everyone was known, and not every victim was remembered as fully human. The case persists because it resists the tidy moral logic of crime narratives. It forces the reader to look at systems, not only individuals. What silence means here. Silence in this story takes several forms. The silence of victims who were selected because their lives could be interrupted quietly. The silence of neighbors trained by poverty to ignore what they could not afford to confront. The silence of institutions that benefited from bodies while maintaining plausible deniability. The silence of women whose roles were domestic and therefore easier to erase from formal record. The silence after verdict when a person is released legally but destroyed socially. This is the legacy that lingers most sharply. The Westport murders are not only about violence. They are about who is allowed to speak, whose absence is noticed, whose body becomes valuable, and whose life is recorded. To center Helen McDougal is not to claim she was the primary actor. It is to refuse the city's habit of letting women become shadows, either blamed without proof or erased without curiosity. Her story, even incomplete, forces a more honest reading of how crime can be sustained not only by hands that kill but by households that continue. The scaffold ended Burke. It did not end the system. The verdict released Helen. It did not restore her. The city learned a lesson it did not fully want, that progress can be fed by the vulnerable, and that silence can be both a weapon and a wound. In the end, Edinburgh remembered the murderers loudly. It remembered the women quietly. And it remembered the victims least of all, except where a nickname or a myth made them convenient to recall. That is the final violence. Not only that they were killed, but that their lives were reduced to what the living needed them to be. Bibliography. Primary sources. Trial of William Burke and Helen McDougal, 1829. Edinburgh, Robert Buchanan, William Hunter, John Stevenson, and London, Baldwin and Craddock. Westport murders. National Records of Scotland, formerly National Archives of Scotland, manuscript sources on arrest, indictments, and trial material relating to Burke, Hare, Helen McDougal, and Margaret Hare. Secondary sources. Rossner, Lisa. The Anatomy Murders, being the true and spectacular history of Edinburgh's notorious Burke and Hare and the man of science who abetted them. Edwards, Owen Dudley. Burke and Hare. Polygon Books. Reference overview. Burke and Hare murders.